What if I told you that long before the Greeks and Romans carved their names into history, there lived a people whose songs, myths, and warriors shaped the ancient world? Yet today, they are almost forgotten. The Thracians, fierce horsemen, golden craftsmen, guardians of mysteries, once roamed the mountains and valleys of the Balkans. They sang to the gods, they fought with curved blades, and they dreamed of life beyond death. From Orpheus, the poet who could charm the underworld, to Spartacus, the gladiator who defied Rome, their legacy is written in blood, in legend, and in treasure buried beneath the earth. Tonight, we journey into their forgotten world, to uncover the truth, the myths, and the dark history of a people whose voices still whisper across time. Welcome to Dark History. Subscribe now, and join us as we awaken the story of the Thracians. Chapter 1. Who were the Thracians? When we think of the great civilizations of the ancient world, our minds are quick to picture the gleaming temples of Athens, the mighty legions of Rome, or the endless sands that carried the mysteries of Egypt. Yet, lying quietly in the shadows of these famous empires, there was another people, less remembered, less celebrated, and yet deeply woven into the fabric of history. These were the Thracians, a people of warriors, poets, and mystics who lived in the lands stretching from the rugged mountains of the Balkans to the shores of the Black Sea. Their story, though often hidden beneath layers of time, is one of mystery, darkness, and fascination. The Thracians were not a single unified nation like Greece or Rome. Instead, they were a collection of tribes scattered across a vast landscape, each with its own leaders and traditions, yet bound together by a shared identity. Ancient historians describe them as fierce in battle, proud in spirit, and deeply connected to the natural world around them. To the Greeks, the Thracians were both feared and admired. To the Romans, they were rebels who never fully submitted, and to later generations, they became ghosts faded from memory, yet leaving behind whispers of who they once were. What makes the Thracians so compelling is not just what we know, but what we do not. Unlike the Greeks, who filled libraries with their philosophies, or the Egyptians, who carved their history into stone, the Thracians left behind almost no written records of their own. Their story must be pieced together from fragments, ancient Greek accounts, Roman descriptions, archaeological discoveries, and the haunting remains of their tombs. This makes their history both frustrating and enchanting. We must imagine them, rebuild their world from scattered clues, and in doing so, walk into the shadows of a forgotten civilization. The Thracians occupied a land rich in beauty but also in danger. Their homeland, known broadly as Thrace, stretched across what is now Bulgaria, northern Greece, and parts of Turkey. It was a land of dense forests, rolling plains, and treacherous mountain passes. The rivers that cut through Thrace carried life and trade, but also became borders of conflict. To live in Thrace was to live in a place both generous and unforgiving. The land shaped its people, and in return, the Thracians shaped legends that would echo for centuries. Their reputation in the ancient world was complex. To the Greeks, they were a paradox. Herodotus, the famous historian, once wrote that if the Thracians had ever united under one ruler, they would have become the most powerful nation on earth. But unity was not in their nature. They preferred independence, even when it left them vulnerable. Instead of one kingdom, Thrace was a tapestry of tribes, some allies, some enemies, always shifting in loyalty and purpose. This refusal to unite may have kept them from building an empire, but it also allowed them to remain unpredictable and fiercely proud. The Thracians were known above all as warriors. Their skill in combat was legendary, and they fought with a ferocity that unsettled their enemies. They wielded curved swords, called romi, designed for slashing, and carried small crescent-shaped shields. Their style of fighting was not the rigid, organized phalanx of the Greeks, or the disciplined formations of Rome. Instead, it was wild, swift, and terrifying ambushes in forests, sudden raids, and relentless charges. They were masters of guerrilla warfare long before the term existed. And while other armies fought for land or wealth, the Thracians often seemed to fight for the sheer joy of battle, as if war itself was part of their spirit. But to see the Thracians only as warriors is to miss their depth. They were also a people of rich, spiritual traditions, deeply connected to the mysteries of life and death. Their religion blended reverence for nature with a fascination for the afterlife. They worshipped powerful gods, many of whom would later influence Greek mythology. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, is thought by many to have Thracian roots. The Thracians celebrated him not in quiet temples, but in wild rituals filled with music, dance, and sometimes blood sacrifice. To them, religion was not separate from life. It was woven into every feast, every battle, every funeral. Burial practices reveal much about who they were. Archaeologists have uncovered Thracian tombs, some grand and decorated with intricate frescoes, others hidden in hills like sleeping giants. Inside these tombs, rulers were buried with weapons, treasures, and even horses, as if preparing for a journey into another world. Death was not an end, but a continuation of existence in a realm beyond. Their belief in the afterlife was so strong that even the Greeks remarked upon it. Puzzled by Thracian rituals that embraced death with almost celebratory acceptance, yet, for all their richness, the Thracians were often painted by outsiders as barbarians. The Greeks, who prided themselves on philosophy and order, described Thracians as uncivilized, drunk on wine, and too wild for refinement. This image, however, was shaped by cultural bias. To the Thracians themselves, their way of life was full of meaning, rooted in courage, honor, and the freedom of their tribes. They had their own poetry, their own music, and their own art. In fact, Thracian music was so admired that Greek legends often speak of Thracian bards like Orpheus, the mythical musician who could charm all living things with his lyre. Whether myth or truth, it reveals how Thracian culture touched the imagination of others. The darkness of their story lies not only in their rituals or their wars, but in their eventual fading from history. For centuries, the Thracians resisted conquest, but the world around them changed. Greeks expanded, Romans marched, and slowly the Thracians were absorbed. Their tribes were broken, their names forgotten, and their culture scattered. What was once a great and fearsome people became shadows in someone else's empire. And so, the Thracians live on not through their own voices, but through the fragments left by those who defeated them. As we begin this journey into their past, we must remember, the Thracians are not simply an ancient people to be studied. They are a reminder of how entire civilizations can rise, thrive, and then vanish, almost without a trace. Their story is one of survival, defiance, and mystery. They were the warriors in the forests, the singers by the fire, the worshippers of gods who blurred the line between life and death. They were both admired and despised, feared and forgotten. And now, as we step deeper into their history, we will uncover not just the facts of who they were, but the atmosphere of their world. The silence of their tombs, the echoes of their songs, the glint of their blades in moonlight. Each chapter will bring us closer to the heart of the Thracians, peeling back the layers of time to reveal a people who lived fiercely, died proudly, and left behind a darkness that still captures our imagination. This is the story of the Thracians, a people in shadows, waiting for us to remember them. Chapter 2: The Land of Thrace. Mountains, Rivers, and Secrets. To understand the Thracians, we must first understand the land they called home. For every civilization, the geography that surrounds them shapes their culture, their beliefs, and their destiny. The Thracians were no different. Their homeland, known broadly as Thrace, was a region of immense beauty and complexity. It was not a single country with borders drawn neatly on a map, but a wide stretch of land that shifted and changed through the centuries. What we call Thrace today spread across parts of modern Bulgaria, northern Greece, and the European side of Turkey. To the ancient world, it was a place that seemed both inviting and forbidding, a land where fertile plains met towering mountains, and rivers carved deep valleys into the earth. The Thracians lived in a landscape of contrasts. To the west stood the rugged Balkan mountains, their peaks crowned with snow in winter and their slopes covered with dense forests that whispered in the wind. These mountains provided both protection and peril. They shielded the Thracian tribes from invaders, but also isolated them, creating natural boundaries that kept the tribes apart and made unity difficult. Hidden within these mountains were caves, springs, and valleys that the Thracians considered sacred. They believed that spirits and gods dwelled in these places. And so the mountains became more than obstacles, they became sanctuaries of mystery. To the south lay the Aegean coast, where the Thracians encountered Greek traders and settlers. Here the land softened into rolling hills and fertile plains, perfect for farming. Grapes and barley grew in abundance, and Thracian wine became famous throughout the ancient world. The Aegean Sea itself provided not just food, but a connection to the wider Mediterranean world. Through its harbors and trade routes, Thracians came into contact with Greeks, Persians, and later Romans. Yet, even as they traded goods, they remained fiercely protective of their own traditions, never fully adopting the ways of their neighbors. To the east stretched the Black Sea, a body of water that seemed endless and mysterious. The Thracians built settlements along its shores, fishing its waters and trading with distant peoples. But the Black Sea was also known for sudden storms and treacherous currents, and many sailors feared its wrath. The Thracians, however, embraced both its gifts and its dangers, as if they saw in the sea a reflection of themselves. Beautiful, bountiful, but unpredictable, the rivers of Thrace were lifelines. The greatest of these was the Danube, Europe's second longest river, which marked the northern boundary of Thracian lands. Flowing from the heart of Europe to the Black Sea, the Danube carried trade, migration, and at times, invasion. For the Thracians, it was both a barrier and a bridge, connecting them to other peoples while also protecting them from northern tribes. Within Thrace itself, smaller rivers like the Maritsa and Hebrus wound their way through valleys, nourishing fields and villages. These rivers were more than sources of water. They were sacred beings, honored in rituals and offerings. To drink from a Thracian river was to share in the life of the land. The Thracian landscape was rich in resources. Gold and silver gleamed in the mountains, and Thracian mines became legendary for their wealth. Ancient authors often spoke of Thracian treasure, describing kings who wore golden armor and nobles who feasted from silver cups. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered burial mounds filled with precious objects, confirming that Thrace was a land of wealth. Yet this wealth was both a blessing and a curse. It drew the attention of neighbors who coveted Thracian riches, making the region a constant target for conquest. But beyond its resources and trade routes, Thrace was a land alive with myth. The Thracians saw their environment not merely as a backdrop to life, but as a living presence, filled with spirits, gods, and mysteries. A forest was never just a collection of trees, it was a sacred space, perhaps the dwelling place of a deity. A cave was not an empty, hollow, it was a gateway to the underworld. Even the winds that swept across the plains were believed to carry voices from beyond. In Thrace, the natural world was a tapestry of the divine, woven into daily life. This spiritual connection to the land shaped Thracian identity. While the Greeks built cities of stone and marble, the Thracians lived closer to nature, in villages of wood and clay, surrounded by fields, forests, and rivers. Their society was less urban, less rigid, and more attuned to the rhythms of the earth. This closeness to nature gave them a reputation for being wild in the eyes of outsiders. But for the Thracians, it was a source of strength. The land was their ally, their teacher, and their eternal companion. The land also influenced their warfare. The forests and mountains of Thrace provided perfect cover for guerrilla tactics. Thracian warriors could vanish into the trees, strike suddenly, and disappear again before their enemies could respond. The Greeks and Romans, used to open-field battles, often struggled against these unpredictable attacks. It was as if the land itself fought alongside the Thracians, turning their home into a natural fortress. Yet, this same geography also contributed to their greatest weakness, disunity. The mountains and rivers that gave each tribe its own secure homeland also kept them apart. Instead of uniting under one leader, the Thracians remained divided, each tribe loyal to its own chiefs and traditions. While this independence gave them resilience, it also prevented them from building an empire. When threatened by great powers, like Persia or Rome, they often lacked the unity needed to resist fully. The Greek historian Herodotus once remarked that if the Thracians could ever set aside their divisions and unite, they would become the strongest people on earth. But geography had written a different fate for them. Their land nurtured them, blessed them with wealth, and gave them strength in battle. But it also ensured that they would remain fragmented. For the Thracians, their homeland was not just where they lived, it was who they were. Every river, every mountain, every field carried meaning. The land whispered their stories, held their dead, and shaped their souls. Even as empires rose and fell around them, the Thracians clung to their connection with Thrace. To lose their land was to lose themselves. And so, as we picture Thrace, we must imagine more than geography. We must imagine the chill of mountain winds, the roar of rivers, the golden glint of treasure hidden beneath the earth. We must see the forests alive with music and ritual, and the coastlines where waves carried both trade and danger. Thrace was a land of contrasts, fresh and poor, beautiful and treacherous, protective and isolating. It was a land that both sustained and doomed the people who lived upon it. This was Thrace, the homeland of the Thracians, a place where nature and spirit met, where beauty and danger walked hand in hand. To know the Thracians, we must always remember the land that shaped them, for without Thrace there could be no Chapter 3. The Tribes of Thrace. Life, Society, and Tradition. The Thracians were not a single people united under one crown, but a mosaic of tribes scattered across a vast and varied land. Each tribe had its own chiefs, customs, and traditions. To outsiders, this made them seem chaotic, a wild people without order. But to the Thracians themselves, their tribal structure was not weakness, it was the rhythm of life, an ancient pattern handed down through generations. The Greek historian, Herodotus, once wrote that the Thracians were the most numerous people in the world after the Indians. While this may have been an exaggeration, it reflects just how many tribes there were. Scholars believe there may have been more than 50 distinct Thracian tribes, each with its own identity. Some lived in the mountains, some in the plains, others near the coasts, yet all shared a common language and culture that bound them together, even if they rarely acted as one nation. One of the most powerful tribes was the Thracians, who lived in the central and eastern parts of Thrace. They were among the first to establish a kind of kingdom, uniting smaller tribes under their rule. During the 5th century BCE, the Thracian kings wielded influence across much of Thrace and were known to the Greeks as wealthy and formidable allies or enemies. But beyond the Thracians were countless other tribes, the Bessi, the Geti, the Triboli, the Thyni, and many more. Each tribe carved out its life in its own corner of Thrace, shaped by its environment and neighbors. Daily life among the Thracian tribes was simple, but deeply connected to the land. Most Thracians lived as farmers, herders, and hunters. Their villages were clusters of wooden houses, surrounded by fields where they grew barley, wheat, and grapes. Goats and sheep grazed on the hillsides, while cattle pulled plows through the fertile plains. Hunting remained important, not only for food, but for skill and prestige. To be a successful hunter was to prove one's strength, agility, and courage quality admired in a warrior. Family formed the heart of Thracian society. Families lived together in extended groups, often several generations sharing one household. The elders held respect, for they carried the memory of ancestors and traditions. Women played a central role, not only in managing the household, but in rituals and songs that kept the spirit of the tribe alive. Thracian women were known by the Greeks for their beauty and strength, often portrayed as fierce in both loyalty and defiance. In some stories, Thracian women took up arms alongside men, defending their homes when danger came. Music and song filled Thracian life. Ancient writers often described Thracians as lovers of music, skilled with instruments like the lyre, pipes, and drums. They sang to the gods, to the land, and to each other, their melodies echoing through valleys and across rivers. The Thracian bard Orpheus, though mythological, was said to have come from Thrace. His songs were believed to charm even the stones and the trees. In this, we see how deeply music was woven into Thracian identity. It was not mere entertainment, but a bridge between the human and the divine. The Thracians were also known for their feasts. Food and drink were more than nourishment. They were celebration. Wine, especially, played a central role. Thracian wine was famous throughout the ancient world, often described as strong and intoxicating. The Greeks traded eagerly for it, though they sometimes mocked the Thracians for drinking it unmixed with water, a custom the Greeks considered barbaric. But for the Thracians, wine was a gift of the gods, a sacred drink that brought both joy and frenzy. Feasts were times of storytelling, music, and dancing, where warriors recounted battles and elders shared wisdom. War, however, was never far from Thracian life. Each tribe maintained warriors, ready to defend their land or raid their neighbors. Thracian warriors were renowned for their skill, speed, and ferocity. They carried curved swords called sika, small shields, and spears, and often wore little armor, preferring speed over protection. Many painted their bodies or wore tattoos, symbols of bravery and tribal pride. To the Greeks and Romans, these tattoos were marks of savagery, but to the Thracians, they were badges of honor, permanent records of who they were. The social structure of Thracian tribes was shaped by chiefs and nobles, who held power through wealth, warfare, and divine authority. Chiefs led their people in war, distributed land, and presided over rituals. Their power was not absolute, for they relied on the loyalty of their warriors and the respect of elders. In some tribes, kingship passed down through families, while in others, leadership depended on strength and ability. Wealth was measured not only in land and cattle, but in treasure gold and silver ornaments, weapons, and jewelry. Chiefs displayed this wealth proudly, reinforcing their status in life and ensuring their remembrance in death. Religion was the thread binding society together. Every tribe honored the gods through sacrifices, festivals, and rituals. The Thracians worshipped deities connected to the earth, sky, and underworld, often blending their own gods with those of neighboring cultures. Some tribes followed the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, whose worship was said to have Thracian origins. These ceremonies often involved music, dance, and frenzied rites, where participants sought to transcend the ordinary world and enter the realm of the divine. Despite their fierce reputation, the Thracians valued hospitality. Travelers and guests were welcomed, offered food and drink, and treated with respect. To mistreat a guest was seen as dishonorable, for the gods themselves could walk among men in disguise. This belief tied into a wider Thracian sense of fate and the unseen powers that guided life. Education for the Thracians was not found in schools, but in daily living. Children learned by observing their elders, joining them in farming, hunting, music, and rituals. Boys were taught to fight and endure hardship, while girls learned the skills of managing a household and participating in sacred songs and ceremonies. Yet both boys and girls grew up surrounded by myths, legends, and traditions that carried the wisdom of their people. Though the Thracians lived in relative simplicity compared to Greeks or Romans, their society was far from primitive. Archaeological discoveries reveal intricate gold jewelry, finely crafted weapons, and richly decorated pottery. These objects show that Thracian artisans possessed great skill and creativity, their work blending functionality with beauty. Still, life was not easy. Tribal rivalries often erupted into conflict, and the constant threat of invasion from Persians, Greeks, or later Romans hung over them. Yet, through it all, the Thracians clung to their way of life. They resisted assimilation, holding fast to their customs, their songs, and their freedom, in the quiet rhythms of farming, in the laughter of feasts, in the music of flutes, and in the courage of warriors. The Thracians lived as a people deeply connected to their land, their tribes, and their gods. They were not an empire, but a tapestry of lives, woven together by tradition. And though their names may be less remembered than those of Greeks or Romans, their society was rich, complex, and enduring. This was the life of the Thracian tribes, a life of simplicity and strength, of music and warfare, of division and pride, a life shaped by the rhythms of the earth and the heartbeat of their people. Chapter 4. The Warriors of Thrace, Fearless Sons of the Balkans. If there is one image that lingers in the imagination of history, it is that of the Thracian warrior. Fierce, proud, and unyielding, the Thracians were renowned across the ancient world for their skill in battle. Their very name struck both admiration and fear into the hearts of Greeks, Persians, and Romans alike. In this chapter, we journey into the heart of their warrior culture, exploring how the Thracians fought, what weapons they wielded, and why they were so respected and feared by their neighbors. The Thracian landscape shaped the warrior spirit, with its rolling mountains, dense forests, and winding rivers. Thrace was not a land of vast open plains, but of rugged terrain. Here, ambushes, skirmishes, and guerrilla tactics thrived. Thracian warriors became masters of sudden strikes, lightning, raids, and hit-and-run warfare. Unlike the heavily armored hoplites of Greece, Thracians favored speed, agility, and cunning. Their battles were not always fought in open fields, but often in forests, ravines, and mountain passes, where knowledge of the land gave them an advantage. One of the most iconic weapons of the Thracians was the rhomphaea, a long curved blade with a deadly edge. Held with both hands, it combined the reach of a spear with the slicing power of a sword. In battle, the rhomphaea could cut through shields, armor, and flesh with terrifying force. Ancient sources tell us that Roman soldiers dreaded facing this weapon, for it could pierce even their disciplined formations. To wield a rhomphaea required both strength and skill, and those who carried it were considered elite among the Thracian warriors. Another hallmark of Thracian warfare was the use of light infantry. Thracian peltasts, lightly armed soldiers, carrying small shields called pelta, were famous for their mobility and effectiveness. Armed with javelins, they could harass enemy lines, disrupt formations, and retreat before the enemy could strike back. Greek generals soon realized the value of Thracian peltasts, and many were hired as mercenaries, fighting in wars far beyond their homeland. In fact, the peltast became a key unit in Greek warfare, directly inspired by Thracian tactics. Thracian warriors were not only skilled fighters, but also ferocious in spirit. Ancient writers describe them as charging into battle with wild cries, painted bodies, and fierce determination. Some accounts even claim that Thracians drank the blood of their enemies, though such stories may have been exaggerated by outsiders to emphasize their savagery. Still, there is no doubt that Thracians embraced a warrior ethos that valued courage, strength, and glory. To die in battle was seen as honorable, a passage to the afterlife where warriors were welcomed as heroes. Armor and clothing reflected this ethos. Many Thracians wore little armor, preferring freedom of movement. Their distinctive cloaks, called zaira, were often made of colorful wool and fastened with ornate brooches. Their helmets were sometimes adorned with animal motifs: wolves, boars, or birds of prey, symbols of ferocity and protection. The Thracian warrior was not just a fighter, but a living embodiment of his tribe's strength and identity. Horses also played a vital role in Thracian warfare. Thracian cavalry was swift and deadly, able to strike suddenly and retreat into the hills. Combined with their knowledge of the land, this made them nearly impossible to pin down. Raiders on horseback could descend upon villages, seize spoils, and vanish into the forests before the enemy could respond. This hit-and-run style of warfare made Thracians both feared raiders and valuable allies. Mercenary work became a way of life for many Thracians. From as early as the 5th century BCE, Thracian warriors could be found fighting in Greek armies, Persian campaigns, and later Roman legions. Their reputation as fearless fighters made them highly sought after, for the Thracians' mercenary service was not just about money, but about honor and adventure. It allowed them to prove their valor in foreign lands and bring back stories and, sometimes, riches to their tribes. One of the most fascinating aspects of Thracian warrior culture was their relationship with death. The Thracians did not see death as an end, but as a continuation of existence. Some tribes, as Herodotus notes, even celebrated death as liberation for the soul. This belief may explain the fearlessness of their warriors, who charged into danger without hesitation. They fought with the conviction that fate was unchangeable, and to meet death in battle was to fulfill destiny with honor. Music and ritual were intertwined with war. Before battle, Thracian warriors often engaged in dances, accompanied by flutes and drums, to stir their spirits and invoke the gods. These war dances were both preparation and prayer, a way to unite the warriors and channel divine energy. Outsiders described these rituals as wild and frenzied, but for Thracians, they were sacred acts of courage. The Thracians' reputation spread far beyond their borders. Greek tragedians wrote of Thracian ferocity. Roman generals warned of the danger they posed. Even centuries later, Byzantine chroniclers remembered them as a people of fearless fighters. This image of the Thracian warrior endured, shaping how history remembers them as both noble and dangerous, allies and enemies, barbarians and heroes. Yet, the Thracians were not only fighters. Their warrior culture was inseparable from their society and spirituality. To fight was not simply to conquer, but to defend their people, honor their gods, and live in harmony with fate. Their warfare was not mindless violence, but an extension of their way of life, shaped by the land, the gods, and the bonds of kinship. In their warrior spirit, we see the essence of Thrace itself, rugged, untamed, and fiercely alive. Though their kingdoms eventually fell, and their tribes faded into the empires that conquered them, the memory of Thracian warriors lives on in the Rhomphia's deadly curve, in the dances of war, and in the ancient songs that once echoed through their mountains. Chapter 5. The religion and gods of the Thracians. Religion was the lifeblood of Thracian society, a force that touched every moment of life and death. To the Thracians, the world was alive with spirits, in the rivers, in the trees, in the mountains, and in the winds that swept across their land. Life was never viewed as separate from the divine. Instead, every hunt, every harvest, every battle, and every feast was intertwined with the will of gods and unseen powers. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, the Thracians did not build large stone temples that still rise proudly today. Their worship was woven into the natural world. Sacred groves, high mountains, caves, and rivers became the altars of their faith. To step into a forest clearing at dawn, where the mist clung to the trees, and the songs of birds echoed in the air, was to step into a holy space. In these places, Thracian priests, shamans, and seers would call upon the gods, offering sacrifices of animals, wine, and sometimes even human lives to ensure the favor of divine forces. One of the most prominent gods among the Thracians was Sabazios, often linked to sky and storm, and later associated with the Greek god Zeus. He was seen as a god of rulership, protection, and the heavens, his power reaching from thunderclouds to the rule of kings. Rituals to Sabazios often involved processions where his sacred symbols, such as the hand of Sabazios, a charm adorned with snakes and other mystical images, were carried among the people. Another powerful deity was Bendis, a goddess of the moon and hunt. Often depicted with bow and arrows, she embodied both fertility and ferocity. Bendis became so admired that the Athenians themselves adopted her cult, blending Thracian practices with their own. Her festivals in Thrace involved music, dance, and torchlit processions through the night, a celebration of mystery and the rhythms of the moon. The Thracians also revered a mysterious figure known simply as the Thracian rider. This was a heroic god, often shown on horseback, slaying wild beasts or snakes, protecting the living, and guiding the souls of the dead. Archaeologists have uncovered countless depictions of this rider on stone reliefs, hinting at his importance to the He was both protector and psychopomp, a guide between the world of mortals and the underworld. Closely connected to these beliefs was a fascination with death and the afterlife. The Thracians did not fear death as an end, but viewed it as a passage into another existence. Ancient writers even claimed that Thracians celebrated when a child was born, mourning the hardships it would face in life, and rejoiced when someone died, for their soul was freed into the eternal. Whether this account is exaggerated or not, it reflects the Thracians' spiritual outlook. Life was temporary, but the spirit endured. Funerary practices reveal how seriously the Thracians took this belief. Nobles and chiefs were buried in large mounds called tumuli, some still visible across the Balkans today. Inside these mounds, archaeologists have found rich treasures: gold masks, weapons, jewelry, pottery, and even chariots. These were not mere possessions, but gifts to accompany the deceased into the next world. Horses were sometimes sacrificed, alongside their masters, loyal companions for the journey beyond. One of the most striking aspects of Thracian religion was their connection to ecstatic rituals. Many scholars believe the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy, had its roots in Thrace. Dionysus was often depicted as a foreign god who arrived in Greece from the north, bringing with him wild rituals, music, and intoxication. In Thrace, similar rites involved wine, dance, and frenzied celebration, where participants sought to leave behind their ordinary selves and touch the divine. For outsiders, these rituals seemed wild, even dangerous, but for the Thracians, they were sacred pathways to commune with gods and spirits. Priests and seers played a vital role in society. They interpreted omens, read the flight of birds, and performed sacrifices to discern the will of the gods. Some tribes, like the Bessi, were famous for their oracles. Greek and Roman writers described how people traveled to Thrace to consult these oracles, seeking knowledge of the future. This shows that Thracian religion was not an isolated tradition, but one that interacted with and influenced surrounding cultures. Magic, too, was part of the Thracian spiritual world. Charms, amulets, and incantations were used for protection, healing, or cursing enemies. Warriors sometimes entered battle wearing talismans blessed by priests, believing these would shield them from harm. Women often carried charms to ensure fertility or safeguard their children. The boundary between religion and magic was thin, for both were ways of engaging with the unseen powers, shaping life. The Thracians also believed strongly in fate. To them, destiny was not something easily escaped. Life and death were written by higher forces, and while humans could seek favor from the gods, they could never completely alter what had been woven. This acceptance of fate may explain the fearlessness of Thracian warriors, who marched into battle unafraid of death, trusting in the path laid out for them. Interestingly, Thracian religion often blended with the cultures they encountered. When Persians, Greeks, or later Romans entered Thrace, the Thracians adopted and adapted foreign gods into their own pantheon. This was not a loss of identity, but a mark of their spiritual openness. Sabazios could be Zeus to the Greeks, Bendis could resemble Artemis, and the Thracian rider could merge with heroes of foreign myth. In this way, their religion remained alive, fluid, and adaptable, never rigid or bound by a single form. At the same time, outsiders often viewed Thracian religion with fear or disdain. To the Greeks, Thracian rituals seemed excessive, too wild, too bloody, too foreign. Human sacrifice, in particular, was often attributed to Thracians, though evidence is scarce. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories reinforced the image of Thrace as a land of mystery, where the line between civilization and savagery blurred. And yet, behind these stories lies a deeper truth. Thracian religion was not chaotic, but deeply meaningful. It reflected a people who lived close to the natural world, who found the divine in forests and rivers, who saw life and death as two halves of the same journey. Their gods were not distant beings but living presences, felt in thunder, moonlight, and wine. When we imagine the Thracians gathered under the night sky, torches blazing, drums echoing, voices raised in song to Bendis or Dionysus, we glimpse the heart of their spirituality. It was not about stone temples or written doctrines, but about experience, about touching the divine through ritual, music, and ecstasy. It was religion lived in the body, in the senses, in the community. This chapter of their history reminds us that the Thracians were more than warriors or tribes. They were a deeply spiritual people, whose faith shaped their world, and whose gods continued to whisper through the ruins of their land. Chapter 6. The Religion of the Thracians, Gods, Spirits, and Sacred Mysteries among the many ancient peoples of Europe. The Thracians stood out not only for their warriors and their music, but also for their deeply spiritual worldview. Religion was not a separate part of their lives. It was the fabric holding everything together. From the rising of the sun to the falling of the moon, from the birth of a child to the death of a warrior, every moment of Thracian life was touched by the presence of gods, spirits, and sacred powers. In this chapter, we enter the mystical heart of Thrace and uncover the spiritual traditions that shaped its people for centuries. The Thracians, unlike the Greeks or Romans, left behind no great temples or written myths. Their beliefs must be pieced together from fragments, the writings of outsiders like Herodotus and Plato, archaeological discoveries from burial sites and sanctuaries, and echoes preserved in folklore. These fragments reveal a religion both unique and mysterious, a blend of shamanic practices, nature worship, and heroic cults that reflected the Thracians' close connection to the land and their warrior spirit. At the center of Thracian spirituality was a reverence for nature. The forests, rivers, mountains, and skies were not mere backdrops to life, but living presences, inhabited by divine powers. The great mountain ranges of Thrace were seen as sacred places, where gods dwelt and where mortals could approach. The divine springs and rivers were honored as sources of life, often linked to healing and prophecy. Even trees and animals carried sacred significance. The eagle, the wolf, and the horse appear again and again in Thracian art, symbols of divine energy and guidance. Among the gods most associated with Thrace was Dionysus, known to the Greeks as the god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation. Yet to the Thracians, Dionysus was far older and more complex than the Greek image of the merry god of revelry. The Thracian Dionysus was a god of wild nature, of life and death, of ecstatic vision, and spiritual liberation. His worship involved music, dance, and trance-like states, through which worshippers believed they could commune with the divine. Some Greek writers even claimed that Dionysus was originally a Thracian god, adopted into Greece and transformed. Over time, another important figure in Thracian religion was Orpheus, the legendary musician and prophet. Though his story is preserved mainly in Greek myth, Orpheus was said to be Thracian by birth, a child of the river god Ogris and the muse Calliope. His music could charm beasts, move trees, and even soften the hearts of the gods of the underworld. In many ways, Orpheus embodied the Thracian fusion of music, spirituality, and mysticism. His descent into the realm of the dead to retrieve his beloved Eurydice echoes Thracian beliefs about the thin veil between life and death, and the power of the soul to journey beyond. Beyond these familiar figures, the Thracians worshipped a variety of deities now half lost to time. One of the most intriguing was the rider god, often depicted in carvings as a horseman hunting or offering gifts. Known simply as the Thracian horseman, this figure seems to have been a protector deity, linked to fertility, the cycle of seasons, and the afterlife. He appears across centuries of Thracian art, suggesting his widespread and enduring importance. His role may have been similar to later heroic cults, where mortal warriors became divine protectors after death. Death itself was central to Thracian religion. Herodotus famously recorded that some Thracian tribes considered death a moment of joy, believing the soul was freed from the body's burdens. Funerary practices reveal a strong belief in the afterlife. Thracian tombs were often richly furnished with weapons, jewelry, and drinking vessels, gifts for the journey beyond. Mounds called tumuli dotted the Thracian landscape, housing the remains of kings and nobles. Some were painted with vivid murals depicting banquets, hunts, and rituals, scenes that may represent both the joys of life and the promise of eternity. The Thracians also practiced rituals that outsiders described as strange and unsettling. Human sacrifice may have played a role in some ceremonies, particularly those linked to warriors and kings. Herodotus mentions that when a Thracian chief died, his wives and servants were sometimes sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. While such accounts may have been exaggerated by Greek writers eager to portray Thracians as barbaric, archaeological evidence does suggest that sacrifices, whether human or animal, were part of their religious practice. Shamanism, too, was deeply woven into Thracian spirituality. Shamans or seers were believed to travel between the worlds of the living and the dead, carrying messages from the spirits. These figures may have used music, dance, or even hallucinogenic substances to enter altered states of consciousness. In such trances, they sought visions, healing, or guidance from the gods. The Thracians' reputation for mystical wisdom was so strong that Greek philosophers like Plato and Pythagoras were said to have been influenced by Thracian spiritual traditions. Women played a prominent role in religious life. Female priestesses, sometimes called bacchantes or maenads in Greek sources, participated in ecstatic rites linked to Dionysus. They danced, sang, and entered states of frenzy, embodying the wild and transformative power of the god. To outsiders, these rituals seemed dangerous, even mad, but to the Thracians, they were sacred acts of connection with forces greater than themselves. The presence of women in these rites reflects the balance of male and female energies within Thracian spirituality, recognition that creation, destruction, life, and death all required harmony. The Thracians also believed in fate and prophecy. Oracles and divination played a role in guiding leaders and warriors. Some sanctuaries, like those dedicated to the god Sabazios, were renowned for their prophetic power. Sabazios himself was a sky and horse god, associated with freedom, fertility, and the boundless power of nature. Worship of Sabazios spread far beyond Thrace, reaching into Greece, Asia Minor, and even Rome. His cult demonstrates how Thracian religious ideas were not confined to their homeland, but influenced the wider ancient world. Music was inseparable from Thracian religion. Flutes, lyres, and drums accompanied both solemn rituals and ecstatic celebrations. For the Thracians, music was not entertainment, but a bridge to the divine. It stirred the soul, opened the heart, and invited the gods to enter. In this way, every song, every dance, every rhythmic beat was an offering, a prayer, a channel of sacred energy. As empires rose around them, Thracian spirituality proved both resilient and adaptable. When the Greeks arrived, Thracian gods merged with Hellenic ones. Dionysus and Orpheus became celebrated across the Greek world, carrying their Thracian roots with them. When Rome expanded into Thrace, the rider god continued to appear in carvings, now blending with Roman symbols. Far from being erased, Thracian religion transformed and endured. Its echoes still heard in later European folklore and tradition. In their beliefs, the Thracians revealed a vision of life, both fierce and gentle. They honored the cycle of nature, celebrated the power of music, embraced the mystery of death, and saw the divine in the wildness of the world. To them, gods were not distant rulers, but present in every tree, river, and heartbeat. Their religion was a living dance of fear and joy, of courage and surrender, of earth and sky entwined. Today, though their temples have crumbled and their rituals have faded, the Thracians' spiritual legacy remains. It whispers from the ancient tombs, sings in the myth of Orpheus, and lingers in the name of Dionysus. It is the reminder that long before written scripture and marble temples, there were people who found the sacred in the wind, the mountain, and the song, and it is this sacred vision that allowed the Thracians to endure warriors, musicians, and seekers of the divine. Chapter 7. The Thracian Spiritual World. Gods, Myths, and Mysteries. The Thracians were not only warriors, farmers, and craftsmen, they were also dreamers and believers. Like many ancient peoples, they lived in a world where the divine was everywhere. The wind in the mountains, the flowing of rivers, the cries of birds at dawn, and the flickering of fire at night, all of these, for the Thracians, carried meaning and sacred power. Their religion was not a written system of dogma, nor did it have the rigid structure of Egyptian temples or Mesopotamian priesthoods. Instead, it was a living, breathing faith rooted in nature, mystery, and awe. In this chapter, we enter the spiritual heart of the Thracians, exploring their gods, their myths, and their rituals, and uncovering how they imagined the unseen forces of life and death. The Greeks, who often interacted with the Thracians, wrote many accounts of their beliefs. Sometimes, these were colored with exaggeration, but they give us a valuable window into Thracian spirituality. To the Greeks, Thrace was a land of wild rites, ecstatic dances, and powerful gods. Some Greek writers described Thracian religion as dark and terrifying, while others saw it as noble and mysterious. The truth lies somewhere in between, in a faith that was deeply tied to survival, courage, and reverence for the unseen. At the heart of Thracian belief was a connection to the cycles of nature. Life, death, and rebirth were central themes. This is not surprising for a people who lived close to the land, dependent on the seasons for harvest and the strength of their herds. Their myths reflected this eternal rhythm, suggesting that the Thracians believed that death was not the end, but a passage into another state of being. They were among the earliest Europeans to develop a belief in immortality, a faith that fascinated and sometimes unsettled their Greek neighbors. One of the most important figures in Thracian mythology was Zalmoxis, a semi-divine teacher, prophet, or god. According to the historian Herodotus, Zalmoxis was once a man, perhaps a wise priest, or a former slave of the philosopher Pythagoras. After traveling and learning, he returned to Thrace and began to teach his people that death was not to be feared. Instead, he promised them that the soul was immortal and would live forever in a blessed state after death. To prove his message, Zalmoxis is said to have vanished into a chamber underground for several years, only to reappear later, convincing the Thracians of his divine power. Some believed he had truly gone to the realm of the dead and returned. Others thought he had staged a great illusion. Whatever the truth, Zalmoxis became a symbol of hope and mystery, and his teachings echoed across Thracian lands for centuries. The cult of Zalmoxis reveals something essential about Thracian spirituality. It was not only about fear of the gods, but also about comfort, reassurance, and the promise of eternal life. This distinguished them from many neighboring cultures, where death was seen as a final, shadowy end. To the Thracians, however, death was more like a doorway, and warriors went into battle without fear, convinced that even if they fell, they would rise again in a better world. Greek writers sometimes mocked this as naive, but it gave Thracian warriors their terrifying courage, making them some of the most fearless fighters in the ancient world. Yet, Zalmoxis was not the only divine figure in Thracian worship. The Thracians had many gods and spirits, often linked to nature and human emotions. Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and frenzy, had deep roots in Thrace. Long before the Greeks adopted Dionysus into their pantheon, the Thracians worshipped him in wild rituals. They believed that, through dance, music, and intoxication, they could reach a state where they touched the divine. The rites of Dionysus were often led by women, called maenads, who entered frenzied states of ecstasy. These ceremonies, often held at night, in forests and mountains, were both feared and respected. To outsiders, they seemed chaotic, even dangerous. But to the Thracians, they were moments of union with the god of life's energy, a way of breaking free from ordinary existence and touching eternity. Fire also held a sacred place in Thracian rituals. Archaeologists have found evidence of fire pits in Thracian sanctuaries, where offerings were burned to the gods. Fire was seen as a purifier and a messenger between worlds. The crackle of flames and the rising smoke carried prayers from earth to sky. In some sites, human remains suggest that sacrifices may have been made, though whether these were symbolic or literal remains a debated question. Some Greek accounts accuse the Thracians of practicing human sacrifice, but modern historians are cautious, recognizing that such claims might reflect cultural bias. Still, it is possible that in moments of crisis before war, famine, or disaster, the Thracians turned to extreme rituals, offering what they valued most to secure divine favor. Music was another key to their spirituality. Thracians were famous musicians, and they believed that music had the power to heal, to inspire, and to connect mortals with the divine. The legendary musician Orpheus, whose songs could charm even the stones and trees, was said to be in myth. Orpheus journeyed to the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, his music so powerful that even Hades, lord of the dead, wept. Though Orpheus ultimately failed in his quest, his story reflects the Thracian belief that through song and ritual, humans could bridge the gap between life and death, between the earthly and the divine. Temples and sanctuaries in Thrace were often simple compared to the grand stone monuments of Greece or Egypt. Many were open-air spaces in forests or on mountaintops, where the sky itself became the roof. Others were built as circular stone enclosures, suggesting a cosmic symbolism, perhaps reflecting the sun, the moon, or the eternal cycle of life. In the sacred site of Perpikon, in modern Bulgaria, archaeologists have uncovered vast stone complexes believed to be Thracian sanctuaries, where priests conducted rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies for centuries. Standing in such places today, one can almost hear the chants, the rhythm of drums, and the voices of people reaching out to the gods. One fascinating aspect of Thracian religion was its mystery cults. Unlike open public worship, mystery rites were secret ceremonies, often involving initiation into hidden knowledge. Those who participated might swear oaths never to reveal what they had seen or learned. These rites could include symbolic death and rebirth, fasting, ecstatic dancing, or other intense experiences meant to transform the initiate. Such cults appealed to the human desire for deeper meaning, for a sense of belonging to a chosen group with access to hidden truths. Some scholars believe that Thracian mystery cults influenced later Greek and Roman religious traditions, including the famous mysteries of Eleusis. For the Thracians, the afterlife was not a vague shadow, but a vivid, real place. Graves of Thracian nobles were filled with treasures, gold jewelry, ornate weapons, fine pottery, even chariots. These were not simply displays of wealth, but gifts for the journey to the next world. Horses, too, were sometimes sacrificed to accompany their masters, suggesting that the afterlife mirrored the richness of life on earth. Thracian tombs, many of which have been discovered in Bulgaria, reveal a belief in continuity after death. The murals inside depict banquets, hunts, and heroic scenes, as if reminding the soul of the joys that awaited beyond the grave. This belief in immortality and the soul's journey shaped Thracian courage, art, and society. Warriors could charge into hopeless battles without fear. Farmers could endure hardship with faith and renewal. Even in the darkest times, they believed that life was part of a grand cycle that would never truly end. It gave them strength, but it also gave their culture a deep sense of mystery that has fascinated outsiders for millennia. The Greeks both admired and feared this Thracian spirituality. On one hand, they saw in Thracian myths, like Orpheus, the beauty of music and the promise of love, stronger than death. On the other, they whispered of dangerous rites, blood-soaked sacrifices, and terrifying gods. In truth, the Thracians embodied both light and shadow in their faith, hope for eternity and awe of the unknown. Their gods could bless, but they could also punish. Their rituals could inspire joy, but they could also strike terror. As we leave this glimpse into the Thracian spiritual world, we begin to see the deeper character of this ancient people. They were not just warriors on the battlefield, but seekers of meaning, poets of myth, and worshippers of the eternal. Their religion was not a mere set of practices, but a vision of the universe, where life and death danced in eternal rhythm, where music and fire touched the divine, and where even in the face of mortality, the human spirit could rise unafraid. Chapter 8. Thracian Warriors, Fearless Sons of the Battlefield. The Thracians have often been remembered first and foremost as warriors. To their neighbors, the Greeks, the Persians, and later the Romans, they were both admired and feared for their martial skill. But to understand Thracian warriors properly, we must go beyond the simple image of wild tribesmen swinging their weapons. Their way of war was not just about fighting. It was tied to their culture, their beliefs, and their way of life. In this chapter, we explore the Thracians as soldiers, mercenaries, and defenders of their homeland, revealing how their courage shaped their reputation across the ancient world. The geography of Thrace played a large role in shaping its warriors. The land was rugged, with forests, rivers, and mountains, creating a natural environment for ambushes and quick raids. Unlike the flat plains of Mesopotamia or the structured battlefields of Greece, Thrace encouraged a style of fighting that was mobile, flexible, and unpredictable. Thracian warriors became masters of guerrilla tactics long before the term existed. They struck swiftly, disappeared into the forests, and re-emerged when least expected. To their enemies, this made them infuriating opponents, nearly impossible to pin down in traditional battle lines. Weapons were an extension of this style. The Thracians are most famously associated with the rhamphia, a long curved sword, or polearm, with a deadly edge. Unlike the shorter swords of the Greeks, or the straight spears of the Persians, the rhamphia was versatile. It could slash with immense force, or pierce through armor with its long blade. Wielding it required strength and skill, and in the hands of a Thracian warrior, it became a weapon of fear. Greek writers often noted how terrifying it was to face such blades, which could cut down shields and even horses. Alongside the rhamphia, the Thracians also carried javelins, bows, and small curved daggers. They valued mobility over heavy armor, preferring light equipment that allowed them to move quickly through forests and hills. Armor, when worn at all, was simple. Many Thracian warriors fought with only a cloak, boots, and a small shield for defense. This was not due to poverty, as some outsiders assumed, but rather a deliberate choice. Heavy armor slowed a warrior down, and in Thrace's terrain, speed was life. A Thracian warrior needed to strike quickly, evade pursuit, and vanish into the shadows. Some wore helmets adorned with animal motifs, wolves, boars, or birds of prey, symbols of ferocity and cunning. These helmets not only protected but also instilled fear in the enemy, turning the warrior into a creature of myth on the battlefield. But perhaps what truly set the Thracian warrior apart was his courage, rooted in the belief that death was not the end. As we saw in Chapter 7, the teachings of Zalmoxis promised immortality for the soul. To a Thracian fighter, to fall in battle was not defeat, but a passage into eternal life. This belief gave them a fearlessness that shocked their enemies. Greek generals recorded how Thracians charged into hopeless battles with laughter, convinced that even in death, they had triumphed. Such bravery was both admired and dreaded, for an enemy unafraid of death is the hardest to overcome. The Thracians were not only warriors of their own land, but also highly sought after as mercenaries. Greek city-states, constantly at war with each other, frequently hired Thracian soldiers. Their skills in light infantry and cavalry made them valuable additions. Two armies dominated by heavy hoplites. In Athens, entire groups of Thracian mercenaries were employed as guards and fighters. The Persians, too, recognized their talent, recruiting Thracians into their vast armies during campaigns against Greece. Wherever they went, Thracian warriors left a mark, their ferocity remembered long after the battles ended. Among the most famous units were the peltasts, light infantry armed with small shields called pelta, and throwing javelins. They were the masters of hit-and-run tactics, harassing heavier troops, disrupting formations, and retreating before the enemy could respond. Greek armies that relied on rigid phalanxes often struggled against these nimble fighters. Over time, the Greeks themselves began to adopt Thracian tactics, acknowledging their effectiveness. In this way, the Thracians influenced not just battles, but the very evolution of warfare in the ancient world. Another feared Thracian force was their cavalry. Thracian horsemen were swift, skilled, and ruthless, capable of striking from unexpected directions. They carried javelins and short spears, attacking in sudden bursts before vanishing into the landscape. In open terrain, they could overwhelm lighter infantry. In forests, they could maneuver where heavier cavalry dared not go. Combined with their infantry, this made Thracian armies highly adaptable, able to fight on many kinds of ground. Yet for all their martial strength, the Thracians were also divided. Unlike centralized states such as Persia, or organized leagues like Greece, Thrace was a land of tribes. Each tribe had its own leaders, its own customs, and often its own ambitions. While this diversity enriched their culture, it also meant that Thracian warriors were often fighting one another. Intertribal warfare was common, sometimes over land, sometimes over resources, and sometimes simply for honor. These conflicts weakened their unity and made it difficult for Thrace to stand as a single, powerful kingdom. Outsiders, particularly the Greeks, and later the Romans, often exploited these divisions, turning Thracian tribes against one another to maintain control. Despite these internal struggles, Thracian warriors earned a reputation across the ancient world that endured for centuries. Their image appears in Greek art, often depicted as fierce, exotic fighters with distinctive cloaks and patterned trousers. To the Greeks, they were both barbaric and noble, a paradox of savagery and skill. To the Persians, they were useful allies, strong and reliable when properly rewarded. To the Romans, they were both enemies and eventual recruits, filling the ranks of gladiator schools and auxiliary legions. Indeed, one of the most famous Thracians of all time became a symbol of freedom and rebellion, Spartacus. Though he lived centuries later, under Roman rule, Spartacus was said to be a Thracian, who had been enslaved and forced into gladiatorial combat. His leadership of a massive slave uprising against Rome remains legendary, a testament to the spirit of Thracian warriors, even under oppression. Spartacus embodied the courage, skill, and unyielding will that had defined Thracian fighters for generations. Ritual also played a role in Thracian warfare. Before battles, warriors likely performed ceremonies to honor their gods, seeking strength and protection. Some sources suggest they drank wine before fighting, not to dull their senses, but to heighten their courage and enter a state of fearless energy. War songs, chants, and the beating of drums stirred their spirits, binding them together as a brotherhood, ready to face death without hesitation. For the Thracians, battle was not just physical, but spiritual, a meeting of worlds where the living and the dead stood side by side. The legacy of Thracian warriors lives on, not only in history, but also in archaeology. Weapons, armor, and graves tell stories of their martial culture. In some tombs, warriors were buried with their rhomphaia, as if ready to fight again in the afterlife. Horses, too, were sometimes laid to rest beside their masters, loyal companions, for eternity. These burials remind us that the Thracians saw warfare not only as a duty, but as part of their identity, an eternal calling that followed them beyond death. To outsiders, Thracians may have seemed wild, unpredictable, even savage. But within their own culture, the warrior was a figure of honor and pride, a protector of the tribe, and a bridge between the mortal world and the eternal. Their courage was not mindless, but rooted in a profound belief in the immortality of the soul. Their tactics were not chaotic, but perfectly suited to their land. Their weapons were not crude, but ingeniously designed for effectiveness. And their legacy was not fleeting, but enduring, influencing the great powers of their time and echoing into legend. As we close this chapter, we see the Thracians not only as fighters, but as a people for whom war was woven into life itself. They remind us that courage is born not only of strength, but also of faith, that even the smallest tribe can shape the strategies of empires, and that the stories of warriors endure long after the clashing of swords has faded. Chapter 9. The Thracian Women's Strength, Mystery, and Influence. When most ancient writers described Thrace, they spoke of warriors, tribes, and kings. But behind these stories stood the women of Thrace, figures who were both mysterious and powerful. To outsiders, they seemed wild, exotic, and sometimes dangerous. To their own people, they were guardians of tradition, voices of prophecy, and, at times, rulers in their own right. In this chapter, we step into the hidden world of Thracian women, exploring their roles as mothers, priestesses, and warriors, and how they shaped the destiny of their people. Life in Thrace was not easy, and women carried great responsibility within the household. They tended the crops, raised animals, and cared for children while their men hunted, fought, or traveled as mercenaries. In a land of rugged hills and fertile valleys, survival required constant work, and women were at the heart of that effort. Their strength came not only from physical labor, but also from resilience. They kept families and tribes united during times of war, famine, and migration. To the Thracians, women were not simply passive figures. They were central to life itself. Yet their influence went far beyond the domestic sphere. Many Thracian women were linked to religion and the spiritual world. As we saw in earlier chapters, Thracian culture was deeply connected to the belief in immortality and the teachings of Zalmoxis. Women often served as priestesses, shamans, or intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. Some ancient writers describe Thracian women as skilled in magic, healing, and prophecy. They used herbs and chants to cure the sick, predict the future, and guide warriors before battle. Their role as spiritual leaders gave them authority. For a tribe without the blessings of its women was thought to be unprotected in both body and soul. The Greeks, who encountered Thracian women, often portrayed them in dramatic ways. In Greek myths, Thracian women appear as fierce and sometimes violent figures. The most famous example is the Bacchantes, or Maenads, women who followed the god Dionysus in ecstatic rituals. Many of these stories were connected to Thrace, where Dionysian worship was especially strong. In frenzied dances, the women were said to lose themselves in divine madness, tearing apart animals or even men with their bare hands. While the Greeks may have exaggerated these accounts, they reflect a truth. Thracian women were seen as deeply tied to wild, ecstatic, and mysterious forces of nature. This connection between Thracian women and Dionysus is significant. The god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation was believed to have originated in Thrace before spreading to Greece. In his worship, women played a leading role, embodying both freedom and danger. To the Greeks, this was both fascinating and frightening. To the Thracians, it was simply part of life. Women channeled divine energy, balancing the rational order of men with the ecstatic power of the gods. Their songs, dances, and rituals were not just entertainment, but a way to keep the bond between humans and the divine alive. But Thracian women were not only priestesses and dancers, they were also warriors. Ancient sources tell us that Thracian women, like their men, could take up arms when needed. In times of invasion or tribal conflict, they defended their homes with fierce determination. Archaeological finds show women buried with weapons, suggesting that female warriors were not unheard of. Some legends even speak of entire bands of warrior women, echoing the famous myths of the Amazons. Whether or not these stories were literal, they reveal how strongly outsiders associated Thracian women with courage and independence in their appearance. Thracian women stood out to Greek observers. They wore long patterned garments, often with bright colors and elaborate embroidery. Jewelry made of bronze, silver, and gold adorned their necks, wrists, and ears. Hair was braided or tied with bands, sometimes covered with veils or headpieces. These details revealed not only beauty, but also status. In Thracian society, wealth was often displayed through clothing and ornaments, and women were key in carrying these symbols of tribal pride. To Greeks used a simpler attire, Thracian women appeared exotic, luxurious, and sometimes intimidating. Marriage among the Thracians was not merely a personal union, but a social and political act. Families arranged marriages to strengthen ties between tribes or clans. Women, therefore, became bridges of alliance, ensuring peace or cooperation between groups. Yet once married, a Thracian woman was not powerless. Evidence suggests she retained influence over household decisions, property, and even inheritance. Some tribes may have allowed women to rule as queens or regents when male heirs were absent. While patriarchal in many ways, Thracian society gave women space for authority and independence that surprised outsiders. Motherhood was also central to Thracian culture. Women raised the next generation of warriors, teaching them values of courage, loyalty, and faith in immortality. Songs and lullabies carried not only comfort, but also history, passing down stories of ancestors and gods. In this way, women were keepers of memory. Through their voices, children learned who they were, where they came from, and what they must become. Without the mothers of Thrace, the traditions of the people would not have endured. There was, however, a darker side to how Thracian women were seen. Greek tragedies often portrayed them as dangerous figures, capable of betrayal or cruelty. One tale speaks of Procne and Philomela, sisters tied to Thrace, who took brutal revenge on a king by murdering his son and serving him as food. While these are myths rather than history, they reflect a fear that Greek men held toward Thracian women, the fear of women who were too powerful, too independent, and too connected to primal forces beyond control. To Greeks, who valued order and moderation, the Thracian woman represented chaos and passion. To the Thracians themselves, she was strength, spirit, and mystery. The relationship between Thracian women and nature was another key aspect of their identity. Living in a land of forests, rivers, and mountains, women were closely tied to the cycles of fertility and harvest. Many rituals centered on the changing of seasons, the planting of crops, and the arrival of spring. Women likely played leading roles in these ceremonies, ensuring that the earth remained fertile and the tribe had enough to survive. Their voices rose in songs to the gods, blending human hope with the rhythm of the natural world. The woman was not only the mother of children, but also the guardian of the land itself. Archaeological discoveries shed light on this connection. In Thracian tombs, statues and figurines of women have been found, often linked to fertility symbols. Jewelry and household items buried with women suggest not only respect but also belief in their continued role in the afterlife. In some cases, female burials were richly decorated, rivaling those of men. This indicates that women held positions of great importance, whether spiritual, social, or political. Far from being hidden figures, they were honored as essential pillars of their society. Thracian women also appear in the art of other cultures. Greek pottery sometimes shows them as dancers, singers, or attendants of Dionysus. In Roman accounts, Thracian women were praised for their beauty and passion, though often described as untamed. These depictions, while filtered through foreign eyes, highlight the fascination and allure that Thracian women held for their neighbors. They were not invisible in history but left impressions strong enough to survive across centuries. If we step back, we see that Thracian women embodied dualities: nurturers and warriors, priestesses and mothers, protectors of life and symbols of destruction. They moved between worlds, the domestic and the spiritual, the ordinary and the divine. This balance made them both respected and feared, both cherished and mythologized. In their complexity, they reflect the Thracian people as a whole. A culture that blended courage with mysticism, earth with sky, and life with death. In the end, the women of Thrace remind us that history is not only written by kings and soldiers, but also by those whose voices carried through homes, songs, and rituals. They shaped the fabric of their society in ways both subtle and profound, ensuring that Thrace remained a land of resilience, mystery, and spirit. Their presence echoes through myths, artifacts, and memory, whispering across time that strength comes in many forms, and that behind every warrior stood a woman who gave him life, courage, and purpose. Chapter 10. Thracian Beliefs Between Life, Death, and Immortality. Among all the peoples of the ancient world, the Thracians were often remembered not only for their ferocity in battle, their beautiful art, or their proud independence, but for something far deeper: their view of life and death. To the Greeks and Romans, the Thracians were strange, almost unsettling, because they held ideas about mortality that seemed alien and mysterious. Where others feared death as the end of existence, the Thracians greeted it almost as a friend, a doorway to another form of being. Their rituals, songs, and prayers revealed a society shaped not by fear of the grave, but by a belief in continuity beyond it. In this chapter, we step into their spiritual world, where life, death, and immortality wove together in ways both haunting and profound. From the earliest sources, Greek writers described the Thracians as people unafraid of death. Herodotus, the historian, was fascinated by their customs. He wrote that some Thracian tribes celebrated when a child was born, mourning that it must now endure the hardships of life, but they held feasts and songs when someone died, for that person was thought to have escaped suffering. To the Greeks, this seemed upside down. To the Thracians, it made perfect sense. Life on earth was fleeting, full of toil and danger, but beyond it lay freedom. The passage into death was not an end, but a transition into a greater, eternal existence. Central to this worldview was the figure of Zalmoxis, a mystical prophetor, perhaps even a god who taught the Thracians that the soul never perished. According to Herodotus, Zalmoxis once lived as a man, gaining wisdom while traveling in Greece. He returned to Thrace, preaching the doctrine of immortality, and his people believed him so completely that even centuries later, his name remained sacred. The story tells that he built a great underground chamber and disappeared into it for years, only to re-emerge alive, convincing all that the soul endured beyond the grave. Whether myth or truth, this tale shows the deep impact of his teachings. Zalmoxis gave the Thracians a sense of destiny beyond death, and in turn, they built rituals and customs around that faith. For the Thracians, immortality did not mean idle rest in some distant paradise. It meant joining ancestors in a world that mirrored their own, where warriors still fought, feasts were still held, and songs were still sung. The tombs unearthed by archaeologists give us clues. Inside these burial mounds, known as tumuli, the dead were laid with weapons, armor, jewelry, food, and even chariots. In some graves, entire horses were buried beside their masters, so that they might ride again in the next world. In others, drinking vessels and feasting equipment were placed, as though the departed would continue to share wine with companions beyond the veil. These practices show that the afterlife was seen as an extension of earthly life, enriched, eternal, and free from sorrow. Yet this belief was not only about comfort, it shaped how the Thracians lived. To a people who thought death was but another beginning, bravery came naturally. Warriors marched into battle with little fear, for even if they fell, they would rise again in another realm. This courage made them formidable enemies, and sought after mercenaries across the Mediterranean. Greek generals and Roman emperors hired Thracian fighters, knowing that their indifference to death made them fierce and unyielding. Behind every sword stroke lay a philosophy. Life is temporary, but honor endures. Rituals surrounding death were rich and layered. Some tribes practiced human sacrifice, offering slaves or captives at the funerals of their chiefs, so that the great leader would not journey into the next life alone. While this horrified outsiders, for the Thracians, it was an act of loyalty. To accompany a master beyond death was seen not as a loss, but as a privilege. Songs were sung, fires were lit, and sometimes entire funerary games were held, much like those of Homeric heroes. The community gathered not to despair, but to ensure the soul's smooth passage into eternity. The Thracians' relationship with music also revealed their beliefs about the afterlife. As mentioned before, Orpheus, the legendary musician of Greek myth, was said to have been Thracian. His songs could charm even stones and trees, but most importantly, he descended into the underworld to bring back his beloved. Whether or not Orpheus was a historical Thracian figure, the myth reflects a truth. Thracians believed that music and song had power over death. In their funerals, mourners sang laments not of despair but of transformation. The melody was not an ending note, but a bridge between two states of being. Women, too, played a central role in these rituals. They were often singers, priestesses, and keepers of sacred herbs. Through chants and offerings, they guided the soul and protected it from harm. They may have invoked gods and spirits to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. In this way, women became guardians of the boundary between life and death, both mourners and celebrants, reminding the community that death was not an abyss, but a gateway. The tomb paintings discovered in Thracian lands give us vivid images of how they envisioned eternity. In one chamber, a noble couple reclines on couches, holding cups of wine, as if forever attending a banquet. Musicians play, servants bring food, and horses stand ready. In another, warriors ride, hunting boars, or fighting foes, their deeds painted to last as long as stone itself. These images are not sorrowful. They are lively, joyous, and proud, echoing the belief that the dead did not vanish, but continued to live in eternal celebration of their identity. At the same time, the Thracians did not ignore the mysteries and fears that surrounded death. Rituals often involved fire, purification, and symbolic journeys. suggesting that they believed in dangers lurking between this life and the next. Charms and amulets were buried with the dead to protect against spirits or hostile forces. Some tombs were carefully sealed, as though to guard both the living and the departed. In these practices, we see not only faith in immortality, but also awareness of the unknown. The Thracians did not deny that death was powerful, they simply believed it was not final. The influence of these beliefs spread far beyond Thrace. Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras and Plato, were intrigued by the idea of the immortal soul. Herodotus himself hinted that the Thracians may have influenced Greek thought on this subject. The notion that the soul endured after the body's death would later become central to many religions, including Christianity. Thus, in their own way, the Thracians contributed to a broader human quest for meaning, leaving a quiet but lasting mark on spiritual history. What is most remarkable is how their view of death made their lives more vivid. Freed from the terror of mortality, they could embrace existence fully, whether in song, battle, or feast. Their courage, joy, and rituals all stemmed from this core belief. To them, life was but the first chapter of a much longer story. Death was merely the turning of a page, and so, the Thracians lived in two worlds at once, the visible and the invisible, the present and the eternal. Their songs echoed across valleys. Their tombs rose as silent guardians, and their warriors fought with the fire of those who feared nothing. To step into their world is to see a people who turned mortality into strength, weaving death not as an end, but as a promise. Chapter 11. Thracian Kings and Chieftains' Power, Ritual, and Rule. When we picture the Thracians, it is tempting to imagine only the wild warriors, the haunting music, or the grand burial mounds scattered across their lands. Yet behind this world stood rulers, kings, and chieftains who held together a society that was both fierce and fragmented. Unlike the great empires of Greece or Rome, Thrace was never a single united kingdom for long. Instead, it was a land of many tribes, each with its own leaders, customs, and ambitions. At times, they quarreled. At other times, they united under powerful figures whose names still echo faintly across history. In this chapter, we enter the lives of those rulers, their rise, their rituals, and the weight of their crowns. The Thracian landscape shaped their politics. Mountains divided valleys, rivers created natural borders, and tribes grew around these boundaries. Each tribe was led by its own chieftain, a man who combined the duties of warrior, judge, and priest. His authority was rooted not only in bloodline, but in his ability to protect his people, to lead them into war, and to uphold sacred customs. Leadership in Thrace was less about absolute rule and more about strength and charisma. A weak chieftain could easily lose his position, replaced by another warrior bold enough to claim it. Yet there were times when unity emerged. Among the Thracian tribes, one group, the Thracians, rose to prominence in the 5th century BCE. There, kings managed to gather many tribes under a single banner, creating what historians call the Thracian kingdom. This was not an empire in the Roman sense, with vast armies and stone cities, but it was a powerful coalition. The Thracian kings collected tribute, managed alliances, and held sway over land stretching from the Aegean coast to the interior plains. At their height, they became known to both Greeks and Persians as rulers of consequence. The Thracian kings lived surrounded by splendor that astonished outsiders. Archaeological discoveries have revealed treasures buried in their tombs: golden wreaths, silver vessels, ornate armor, and delicate jewelry. Such riches tell us that these kings were not mere tribal chiefs, but rulers who projected majesty and divine favor. They held courts where warriors, poets, and emissaries gathered, feasting in halls adorned with symbols of both power and faith. Their feasts were not only celebrations, but also political tools, binding allies and displaying the wealth of the throne. One of the most fascinating aspects of Thracian kingship was its ritual dimension. To rule in Thrace was not only to govern, but also to stand at the threshold between mortals and gods. Kings were often seen as chosen, blessed by divine will. Their role in sacrifices and religious ceremonies reinforced this. They poured libations, invoked deities, and presided over festivals that reminded their people of the link between throne and heaven. The very burial of kings in monumental mounds reflects this sacred dimension. Their tombs were not simple graves, but symbolic gateways to the afterlife, where rulers continued their authority among the ancestors. Power, however, was never absolute. The Thracians valued freedom, and their tribal system meant that a king's influence always depended on his ability to persuade, reward, and protect. Alliances were fragile, and rival chiefs could rise quickly. Many Thracian kings found themselves caught in a delicate balance, keeping their own warriors loyal, managing neighboring tribes, and negotiating with foreign powers like Greece, Persia, and later Rome. This constant tension gave Thracian politics a restless, shifting quality. Despite this instability, some names survive in records. Sitalces, a 5th-century king of the Odrysians, is remembered for his dealings with Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Greek historians describe him as a figure of considerable strength, leading armies across the Balkans and shaping events beyond Thrace's borders. Under kings like Sitalces, Thrace was no longer just a frontier land, it was a political force, capable of allying with or threatening the great powers of the classical world. Other rulers gained fame through their wealth and love of display. Excavations of Thracian tombs at places like Kazanluk and Speshtari reveal kings buried with painted chambers, gold death masks, and intricate carvings. One tomb shows a ruler reclining at a banquet, his wife beside him, eternal companions in the next life. Another is decorated with scenes of horsemen and gods, blending earthly power with divine protection. These monuments remind us that Thracian kings saw themselves not only as leaders of men, but as part of a cosmic order, destined to rule even beyond death. The authority of kings was reinforced by warrior retinues, bands of loyal fighters who surrounded the ruler, fought for him, and feasted in his halls. Loyalty was often rewarded with gifts, weapons, horses, or treasures captured in raids. Such bonds were deeply personal. A king's strength was measured not in laws or decrees, but in the devotion of his warriors. This system, based on honor and gift-giving, foreshadowed the warrior-lord traditions of medieval Europe centuries later. Yet kingship also carried danger. In a land where power was tied to strength, a ruler could fall quickly. Betrayal, rival claims, or defeat in battle could strip him of everything. Some Thracian kings were killed by their own warriors, others replaced by ambitious relatives. The tombs that survive are silent reminders of both grandeur and fragility, magnificent in death, yet hinting at lives lived under constant threat. Foreigners often misunderstood Thracian kingship. To the Greeks, Thracian rulers seemed half barbaric, half majestic. They admired their gold and feasts, but criticized their drinking and violence. To the Persians, Thracians were a frontier people, useful as mercenaries, troublesome as enemies. To the Romans, they became both subjects and symbols of resistance, remembered for their fierce independence. Through all these views, the image of the Thracian king remained shadowed, somewhere between barbarian chieftain and sacred monarch. The mystery of Thracian kingship lingers today in their monumental tombs. When one enters these underground chambers, painted with colors still vivid after millennia, it feels as though stepping into another world. Here, kings recline forever at banquets, ride forever on their horses, and wear golden wreaths that never fade. The silence of the earth keeps their secrets, but the artistry of their tombs whispers of a society where rulers were more than men. They were bridges between this world and the next. In the end, Thracian kings were less like the emperors of Rome or the pharaohs of Egypt, and more like keepers of balance. They stood at the center of a web of tribes, alliances, warriors, and gods. Their power was fragile, yet profound, built on charisma, wealth, and ritual. Though history remembers them only faintly, their tombs, treasures, and legends still tell us of a time when kings ruled, not only with swords and gold, but with the mystery of immortality itself. Chapter 12. Thracian Warriors, the fierce and the fearsome. When one thinks of the Thracians, it is often the image of the warrior that rises most vividly to mind. The ancient Greeks, who knew the Thracians well, described them as fearless fighters, quick to anger, and skilled in battle. They were both admired and feared, for the Thracians carried into war a ferocity that seemed untamed by the laws of civilization. In this chapter, we step into their world, the weapons they carried, the battles they fought, and the warrior spirit that defined them for centuries. The Thracians were a people of many tribes, scattered across the lands of southeastern Europe. This fragmentation meant they were constantly engaged in conflicts, sometimes with neighboring tribes, sometimes with foreign powers. For a man, warfare was not merely an occasional duty. It was woven into daily life. To fight, to defend, and to raid was part of the very rhythm of their existence. Honor, wealth, and survival all depended on strength in battle. Greek writers often remarked upon the appearance of Thracian warriors. They wore distinctive clothing, cloaks of patterned fabric, pointed caps called foxskin hats, and boots laced high upon their legs. Unlike the armored hoplites of Greece, Thracians favored lighter equipment that allowed them to move swiftly across their rugged landscapes. Their shields were small and crescent-shaped, easy to carry, and quick to maneuver. Their main weapons were spears, javelins, and curved swords known as sika. The sika, with its inward curve, was especially feared, for it could hook around shields and armor, striking where enemies were most vulnerable. The style of Thracian warfare reflected their environment. Living among forests, mountains, and rivers, they became masters of ambush and surprise attacks. Instead of facing enemies in rigid formations, they struck swiftly and vanished, using the land to their advantage. This guerrilla style confused the heavily armed soldiers of Greece and Rome, who struggled to match the speed and unpredictability of Thracian tactics. Yet Thracians were not only raiders, they were also valued mercenaries. Many Greek cities hired Thracian warriors to fight in their armies. The Athenians, for instance, employed units of Thracian archers who became a familiar sight in the city. These mercenaries brought with them not only skill, but also a reputation for loyalty. Once paid and honored, they fought with vigor, often tipping the balance in battles far from their homeland. Thracian warriors were also renowned for their connection to horses. The Thracians were among the earliest peoples in Europe to master horsemanship, and their cavalry was both swift and deadly. Mounted Thracians carried spears and javelins, striking quickly before retreating beyond reach. Horse burials found in Thracian tombs reveal how deeply this bond with horses ran. To die as a warrior often meant being buried with one's steed, ensuring that the bond of rider and horse continued into the afterlife. The warrior's life was not only about fighting, but also about ritual and honor. Before battle, Thracians often performed sacrifices to their gods, calling upon divine favor. They believed that courage was a sacred duty, and that death in battle was not a tragedy but a path to honor. Some accounts suggest that Thracian women sang songs of lament or triumph for fallen warriors, ensuring their deeds were remembered. In this way, war was both a practical necessity and a sacred act, linking mortal struggle to the eternal order of the gods. Greek historians often described Thracians as warlike and barbarian, but behind these labels was a culture that valued freedom and strength. To a Thracian, to live under domination was worse than death. This fierce independence explains why Thracians resisted foreign rule for so long. Even when conquered by larger empires, Thracian warriors continued to fight in uprisings, rebellions, and as auxiliaries in distant campaigns. One of the most famous Thracian warriors to emerge in history was Spartacus. Though he lived centuries later, under Roman rule, Spartacus embodied the Thracian warrior spirit. Enslaved and forced into gladiatorial combat, he rose to lead a massive rebellion against Rome itself. His courage, skill, and refusal to accept domination echoed the values of his ancestors. Though his revolt was crushed, his name became immortal, a symbol of resistance and the unyielding Thracian spirit. Archaeological evidence adds depth to these stories. Weapons found in Thracian graves, swords, daggers, helmets, and armor reveal both craftsmanship and artistry. Some were decorated with animal motifs, suggesting a belief that the warrior could draw power from the spirit of the beast. Others were practical, designed for swift strikes and survival. These graves also show that warriors were honored in death, buried with their weapons, drinking vessels, and treasures, as though their struggle continued in the next world. The Thracian warrior was not a solitary figure, but part of a larger community. His bravery brought honor to his family and tribe. His victories ensured survival, wealth, and prestige. Even in times of peace, warriors held status, feasting in the halls of kings and receiving gifts for their loyalty. Their songs and stories became the foundation of Thracian identity, teaching new generations that strength, courage, and freedom were the highest virtues. To outsiders, Thracians appeared wild and unpredictable. To themselves, they were simply living by the code of their ancestors. Their wars were not only for land or riches, but for honor, independence, and the right to live unbound. In their spears and swords, in their songs and sacrifices, we see the heartbeat of a people who embraced both life and death with fearless intensity. Today, when we think of Thracian warriors, it is not only their battles that remain, but also the image of their spirit untamed, fierce, and free. They remind us that beyond the empires and great cities of the ancient world were peoples who fought not for monuments or conquest, but for survival and pride. The warrior's cry of Thrace, once echoing through forests and valleys, still resonates across time, carrying the memory of a people who refused to be broken. Chapter 13. Thracian kings and chieftains, rulers of a divided land. The Thracians were a people of many tribes, scattered across the mountains, valleys, and plains of southeastern Europe. Unlike the great centralized states of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Thrace never unified under one lasting kingdom. Instead, it was a mosaic of tribes, each with its own leader, customs, and rivalries. At the heart of each tribe stood the figure of the king, or chieftain, a leader who embodied both warrior strength and sacred authority. In this chapter, we journey into the world of Thracian rulers, men who commanded loyalty, led in battle, and presided over ceremonies that bound their people together. To understand Thracian kingship, one must first grasp the geography and society of Thrace. The land itself was rugged and diverse, mountains rich in minerals, fertile plains for farming, and forests teeming with game. These resources supported many small communities, but they also encouraged separation. Villages were often isolated, making it difficult for a single ruler to dominate large regions. Instead, power rested in the hands of local chiefs, each ruling a tribe or cluster of clans. These leaders were not kings in the grand sense of pharaohs or emperors, yet within their domains, their authority was absolute. They commanded warriors, judged disputes, and acted as intermediaries between their people and the divine. Their power was displayed in feasts, in treasure, and most strikingly, in their burial mounds, magnificent tombs filled with gold, weapons, and symbols of prestige. Archaeological discoveries have given us glimpses into their lives. The great tombs of Thracian rulers, such as those at Kazanlak and Sveshtari, reveal not only wealth, but also artistry. Painted walls show processions of horsemen, banquets, and rituals, all centering on the figure of the ruler. Gold masks, diadems, and richly decorated vessels testify to the splendor that surrounded Thracian kingship. These were not mere tribal leaders, they were figures of majesty, whose memory was honored long after death. Yet Thracian kingship was also precarious. With so many tribes, alliances shifted constantly, and rivalries often erupted into warfare. A powerful chieftain might dominate his neighbors for a time, only to see his influence fade with his death. Greek historians remarked that the Thracians were difficult to unite, for each tribe valued its independence fiercely. This division prevented the Thracians from building an empire, yet it also kept their culture vibrant and diverse. Among the most notable Thracian rulers was King Sutus III, who reigned in the 4th century BCE. His name survives through inscriptions, coins, and the magnificent Thracian tomb of Kazanlak, believed to be connected to his dynasty. Sutus sought to unite Thracian tribes and resist the encroaching power of Macedonia. After the conquests of Alexander the Great, his capital, Suthopolis, though now submerged beneath a reservoir, was once a thriving city that showcased both Thracian and Greek influences. Sutus's reign demonstrated how Thracian kings adapted to the changing world, blending local traditions with external ideas while still maintaining their warrior spirit. Other rulers, like Thraci and Cytalzi, commanded wide territories and engaged with the great powers of their time. The Odrysian kingdom, formed in the 5th century BCE, was the closest the Thracians came to unification. Its rulers held sway over large swaths of Thrace, collecting tribute and maintaining diplomatic ties with Athens, Sparta, and Persia. Yet, even the Odrysian kings struggled to maintain unity among the fractious tribes. Their power waxed and waned, depending on the strength and charisma of the king. The role of Thracian kings extended beyond politics and war. They were deeply connected to the sacred. Many scholars believe that Thracian rulers were seen as chosen by the gods, perhaps even semi-divine themselves. The rituals surrounding their deaths support this idea. Tombs were not simple burials, but elaborate ceremonies filled with symbolism. Horses were sacrificed to accompany the king, feasts were held in his honor, and treasures were placed at his side to ensure his journey into the afterlife. In these acts, the ruler was transformed from man to ancestor, becoming a guardian spirit for his people. Feasting was an essential part of kingship. Greek writers described Thracian banquets where rulers sat upon raised thrones, drinking from golden cups, while bards sang of heroic deeds. These feasts were not mere indulgence, but expressions of power and generosity. By sharing wealth with their warriors, kings secured loyalty and reinforced the bonds that held their tribes together. To sit at the king's table was an honor. To be excluded was a mark of shame. The Thracian ruler's identity was also tied to warfare. A king was expected to be a warrior first and foremost, leading his men into battle. His strength in combat was a symbol of his legitimacy. Without martial prowess, a ruler could not command respect. This warrior kingship was deeply ingrained in Thracian culture, blending the sacred with the practical. Victory brought prestige, not only to the ruler, but also to his entire tribe. Yet kingship also carried dangers. A ruler who grew too powerful risked rebellion from jealous neighbors. Greek accounts tell of Thracian kings who were assassinated by rivals or betrayed by their own kin. In such a fragmented society, leadership required constant vigilance, diplomacy, and the ability to inspire loyalty through both generosity and fear. The image of Thracian kingship was remembered in song and story. Bards and poets celebrated the deeds of rulers, ensuring their fame lived on even after their tombs were sealed. These oral traditions, though mostly lost to history, must have played a vital role in shaping Thracian identity. The memory of a great king was not just a matter of pride, but a source of guidance for future generations. When the Greeks and Romans encountered Thracian kings, they were often struck by their blend of majesty and savagery. To outsiders, the wealth of Thracian rulers seemed surprising for a people considered barbarian. Yet this wealth was real, built on trade, tribute, and the control of rich natural resources. Gold mines, fertile lands, and skilled artisans made Thrace a land of abundance, and its rulers knew how to display that abundance in ways that impressed both allies and enemies. Even as Thrace came under foreign domination, the image of the Thracian king persisted. Some rulers became client kings under Macedonian and later Roman influence, adapting to new political realities while still maintaining their traditional roles. Their tombs continued to be built, their treasures buried, their memory honored. In this way, the institution of kingship bridged the old world and the new, preserving Thracian identity in times of great change. Ultimately, Thracian kings and chieftains were more than political figures. They were symbols of a people's resilience and pride. They embodied the warrior spirit, the sacred traditions, and the fierce independence that defined Thrace. Though their kingdoms were fragile and often fleeting, their legacy endures in the monuments they left behind and in the echoes of their names. The story of Thracian kings reminds us that power is not always measured by vast empires or written records. Sometimes it is found in the strength of a leader who inspires loyalty, in the treasures buried beneath a mound of earth, or in the songs of a people who remember their rulers long after their time has passed. In the shadows of Thracian tombs, lit by flickering torchlight, we can still sense the presence of these kings, guardians of a divided land, whose authority rested not only on gold and swords, but on the enduring spirit of their people. Chapter 14. The Thracian Pantheon, Gods, Spirits, and Sacred Beliefs. Religion lies at the heart of every civilization, shaping its values, rituals, and sense of the unknown. For the Thracians who lived among towering mountains, deep forests, and winding rivers, the divine world was inseparable from the natural one. Their gods and spirits did not dwell in Pharaoh of heavens, but in the very landscapes that surrounded them. In this chapter, we explore the Thracian pantheon, a mysterious collection of deities, heroes, and spirits whose worship defined Thracian culture. The Thracians did not leave behind written myths like the Greeks or detailed hymns like the Mesopotamians. Instead, their beliefs survive through fragments, references in Greek and Roman sources, archaeological discoveries, and the echoes of rituals preserved in art. From these traces, we piece together a religion, both unique and interconnected, one that reveals how the Thracians understood life, death, and the mysteries beyond. At the center of Thracian worship stood the great mother goddess. Known by different names across tribes, she was often depicted seated on a throne, flanked by lions or holding a cornucopia of fruits. To the Thracians, she was the giver of life, fertility, and abundance. The earth itself was her body, and her cycles mirrored the growth of crops, the birth of animals, and the renewal of human life. Her cult connected the Thracians to other ancient peoples, such as the Phrygians, who worshipped Cybele, and the Greeks, who honored Demeter. Yet in Thrace, the mother was not merely nurturing, she also embodied wild power, a reminder that nature could provide, but also destroy. Alongside the mother stood her son and consort, often described as a dying and reborn god. Though his name varied, he symbolized vegetation, renewal, and the eternal cycle of life. Each year he perished, and each year he returned, mirroring the rhythms of the seasons. This belief connected directly to Thracian agricultural life, where survival depended on the return of spring and the fertility of the soil. Through ritual lamentations and celebrations, the Thracians enacted his story, ensuring harmony between themselves and the natural world. Another central figure of the Thracian pantheon was Sabazios, a sky and storm god often associated with the Greek Zeus. Depicted as a horseman wielding a spear, Sabazios was a protector of warriors, travelers, and rulers. His image appears frequently in Thracian art, suggesting widespread devotion. The horseman motif, in particular, became a powerful symbol in Thracian religion, one that blended divine strength with heroic identity. To the Thracians, the horseman was not only a god but also an ideal, representing bravery, speed, and the bond between man and nature. Death and the afterlife were also central to Thracian belief. The Thracians viewed death not as an end, but as a transformation. Tombs and burial rituals reveal a conviction that the soul continued its journey in another world. Gold funeral masks, such as those found at Svetseta and elsewhere, suggest that rulers were prepared for this journey with care. The presence of horses, weapons, and treasures in graves reflects the belief that the afterlife required the same tools and symbols of status as earthly life. This perspective was tied to the Orphic tradition, a spiritual movement that some scholars believe originated in Thrace. The legendary figure, Orpheus, the poet who charmed all living things with his music, was said to be Thracian. His myths speak of journeys to the underworld, the power of music to touch the divine, and the hope of a blessed afterlife for the initiated. Orphism emphasized purification, reincarnation, and the soul's escape from the cycle of rebirth of philosophy that deeply influenced Greek thought. If Orphic rituals truly began in Thrace, then the Thracians contributed one of the most profound spiritual traditions of the ancient world. The Thracians also revered river and mountain spirits. Sacred springs and caves were considered gateways to the divine, places where offerings were made and rituals performed. Archaeologists have found altars carved into rock faces, where libations of wine and milk may have been poured. These natural sanctuaries remind us that Thracian religion was not confined to temples, but lived in the open landscape. Mountains like Rhodope, and rivers like the Hebrus, modern Maritsa carried mythic significance. Embodying the presence of gods, sacrifice played a vital role in Thracian worship. Animals were offered to appease the gods, and in rare cases, human sacrifices mentioned in ancient accounts, though whether this was common practice or exaggeration by outsiders remains uncertain. What is clear is that sacrifice was a way to maintain balance between the human and divine worlds. Wine, too, had sacred value. Thrace was famous for its vineyards, and wine was more than a drink. It was a medium of communion with the gods. Feasting, accompanied by ritual drinking, reinforced bonds among the tribe and connected the living to the sacred. The Thracians' reputation for ecstatic rites is another intriguing element of their religion. Greek writers described wild dances, music, and trances during Thracian rituals. These states of ecstasy were not mere entertainment, but a way of entering communion with divine forces. Through rhythm, movement, and intoxication, participants could transcend ordinary existence and touch the spirit world. This ecstatic worship echoed the later practices of the Dionysian cult in Greece. Unsurprising, as Dionysus himself was sometimes believed to have Thracian origins. The pantheon of Thrace was not rigidly fixed like that of Greece or Rome. Instead, it was fluid, with deities overlapping, merging, and adapting to different tribes. A god worshipped in the mountains might take on a different form in the plains. As Thracians came into contact with Greeks, Persians, and later Romans, their gods were identified with foreign deities, creating rich blends of belief. Sabazios, for example, was equated with Zeus by Greeks, and later associated with Jupiter by Romans. The Thracian mother was linked with Artemis, Demeter, and Cybele, depending on the context. This adaptability reveals the openness of Thracian spirituality, capable of absorbing influences while maintaining its distinct essence. Priests and priestesses likely played an important role in Thracian society, though direct evidence is scarce. Greek sources mention Thracian prophets and seers. Herodotus wrote of the Geti, a Thracian tribe that believed in immortality and sent messengers to their god, Zalmoxis, through ritual sacrifice. These messengers, chosen by lot, were slain and believed to carry prayers to the divine realm. Zalmoxis himself, worshipped as both man and god, embodied the fusion of hero, prophet, and deity. Some scholars see in Zalmox's echoes of early monotheistic thought, a striking development in the ancient world. The visual language of Thracian religion is preserved in art. Rings, vessels, and reliefs depict gods, horsemen, animals, and sacred symbols. One recurring image is the Thracian horseman, shown riding with a spear, often accompanied by hunting dogs or offering gifts to a goddess. This motif, widespread and enduring, suggests a central unifying symbol across Thracian culture. The horseman may represent not only a god, but also the idea of the human soul journeying through life and death, ever striving for connection with the divine. For the Thracians, religion was not separate from daily life. It infused warfare, agriculture, feasting, and governance. Kings derived authority from divine sanction. Warriors fought under the blessing of horsemen gods. Farmers planted seeds in rituals tied to the mother's fertility. Even in death, individuals remained part of the spiritual community, their tombs serving as both resting places and sacred monuments. What emerges from this mosaic is a religion, at once local and cosmic, practical and mystical. The Thracians sought to honor the forces that gave life, guided destiny, and shaped the mysterious passage beyond death. Their pantheon reflected the richness of their environment, the depth of their imagination, and the intensity of their experiences as a people on the margins of great empires, yet firmly rooted in their own traditions. Though time has eroded much of Thracian religion, its spirit endures in fragments, gold masks glinting in the dark of museums, stone carvings of horsemen, echoes of Orpheus's song. Through these remnants, we glimpse a world where gods rode with warriors. Mothers gave life to the earth itself, and death opened a door not to silence, but to transformation. The Thracian pantheon may never be fully reconstructed, but its essence remains a faith deeply connected to nature, to ecstasy, and to the eternal dance of life and death. It is this spiritual legacy, as much as their warriors or rulers, that defines the Thracians as one of the most intriguing peoples of the ancient world. Chapter 15. Thracian warriors. Between myth and reality, when we imagine the Thracians, one image stands above all others, that of the warrior. Ancient writers, Greek vase paintings, and Roman accounts all emphasize the Thracians' reputation for bravery, ferocity, and unpredictability in battle. They were feared as mercenaries, admired for their skill, and romanticized as untamed fighters living on the edge of civilization. But behind the myths and exaggerations lies a deeper truth. The Thracians were not only warriors, but people whose martial traditions reflected their environment, their social values, and their view of the world. In this chapter, we will explore who these warriors were, how they fought, and why they became legendary in the ancient imagination. The Thracians lived in a land of forests, hills, and rivers. This terrain shaped their warfare. Unlike the organized phalanxes of the Greeks, Thracian fighting relied on flexibility, speed, and ambush tactics. They were skilled in moving through difficult landscapes, striking quickly, and retreating before the enemy could respond. Their style of combat often appeared chaotic to outsiders, but it was deeply suited to their environment. The Thracian warrior was not bound by the rigid discipline of city-state armies. Instead, he embodied a spirit of freedom and adaptability. One of the most distinctive features of Thracian warriors was their weaponry. They carried the rhomphaia, a curved blade with a long handle, capable of slicing through armor and shields with terrifying force. Unlike a short sword, the rhomphaia demanded strength and precision, turning the warrior into a deadly force in close combat. Greek and Roman soldiers respected and feared this weapon, which could change the tide of battle when wielded by skilled hands. In addition to the rhomphaia, Thracians used spears, bows, and javelins, reflecting their versatility in both melee and ranged combat. Armor among the Thracians varied. Many warriors fought lightly armed, wearing little more than cloaks and leather. This lightness allowed for mobility, fitting their preference for quick strikes. Some, however, wore helmets made of bronze or iron, decorated with plumes or animal motifs. Archaeological discoveries reveal helmets shaped like fox heads, boars, or birds, perhaps intended to invoke the spirit of these animals in battle. Shields, often crescent-shaped, offered protection without sacrificing speed. Clothing itself carried symbolic meaning. Brightly colored cloaks, patterned tunics, and tattoos marked the Thracians as distinct. These decorations were not mere ornaments, but expressions of identity, signaling tribal belonging and personal courage. The Thracians also had a reputation for their use of psychological warfare. Ancient accounts describe them painting their bodies, shouting war cries, and dancing before battle. Music, too, played a role. Pipes, drums, and horns echoed across the battlefield, creating a mixture of rhythm and intimidation. To their enemies, these displays seemed barbaric. To the Thracians, they were acts of power, meant to summon courage within and instill fear without. Mercenary service became one of the hallmarks of Thracian warriors. From as early as the 5th century BCE, Thracians were sought after by Greek states, Macedonian kings, and later Roman generals. Their skill in unconventional warfare made them valuable auxiliaries, often placed in roles requiring mobility and aggression. Thracian mercenaries appear in Athenian records, serving as guards, police, and soldiers in foreign campaigns. Some rose to fame, such as those who fought alongside Alexander the Great. Their willingness to fight for pay reflected not only economic necessity, but also the Thracian tradition of valor and independence. Yet war was not only about external service. Among themselves, Thracian tribes often engaged in conflict. Raids, feuds, and struggles for dominance were common, driven by competition for land, resources, and prestige. These internal conflicts reinforced the warrior ethos. A man's reputation depended on his courage in battle, his success in raids, and his ability to defend his kin. To shrink from fighting was to lose honor, while to face danger boldly was to gain lasting renown. Songs, dances, and stories celebrated the deeds of warriors, ensuring their fame lived on beyond death. The Thracians' relationship with death in battle was unique. Unlike many cultures that mourned the loss of warriors, the Thracians often celebrated it. Ancient writers report that Thracian tribes believed death in combat brought honor, while a peaceful death was less desirable. Funerals could be marked with feasting, music, and even contests, turning death into a passage to glory rather than an end. This perspective reinforced the warrior identity, for it meant that every battle carried the potential for eternal remembrance. Women, too, may have had roles as warriors. While the evidence is debated, some graves contain weapons buried alongside women, suggesting they may have participated in combat, or at least shared in martial symbolism. Greek myths about Amazon-like women from Thrace reflect this perception, even if exaggerated. What is clear is that Thracian society honored strength and courage in both men and women, weaving these values into its cultural fabric. One of the most famous Thracian warriors in history was Spartacus, the gladiator who led a massive slave revolt against Rome in the 1st century BCE, though not all details of his origins are certain. Sources identify him as Thracian. His leadership, charisma, and determination reflect the qualities admired among his people. Spartacus's rebellion shook the Roman Republic and became a symbol of resistance against oppression. Through him, the Thracian warrior spirit entered the annals of world history. Remembered not only as a mercenary, but as a liberator, the Thracians' reputation also left an imprint on their neighbors. The Greeks admired their bravery, but called them barbaric outsiders who lived beyond the borders of civilization. At the same time, Greek art often depicted Thracians with fascination, portraying their distinct clothing, weapons, and dances. To the Greeks, Thracians embodied both danger and allure, dangerous as foes, yet alluring as symbols of wild freedom. The Romans, too, both feared and respected Thracian fighters, incorporating them into legions and gladiatorial games. In considering Thracian warriors, we must balance myth and reality. They were not simply bloodthirsty barbarians, as outsiders sometimes described them. They were skilled fighters whose style reflected their land, whose bravery was tied to cultural values, and whose adaptability allowed them to serve across the ancient world. Their warrior identity was not an isolated aspect of life, but intertwined with religion, social honor, and the cycles of nature. The image of the Thracian warrior survives today in fragments. The curve of a ramphaea blade, the bright patterns of preserved textiles, the haunting silence of tombs filled with weapons. These remnants remind us that the Thracians lived in a world where courage defined existence, where the line between myth and reality blurred, and where warriors stood at the heart of society. To the ancient world, the Thracians were both feared and admired. To us, they remain a people whose warrior spirit reveals not only how they fought, but how they lived, dreamed, and remembered. Their legacy lies not only in the battles they fought, but in the enduring image of the warrior as a figure of both power and mystery, standing at the crossroads of history and legend. Chapter 16. Thracian, Art and Symbolism. Voices. Carved in stone and gold. When we think of a people long vanished from the world, what remains most vividly are not only their battles or their kings, but the art they left behind. Though often remembered in history for their warriors and mercenaries, also possessed a deep and expressive artistic tradition. Their art was not merely decoration. It was an expression of their beliefs, their connections with the natural world, and their vision of life and death. Through goldwork, carvings, pottery, and monumental tombs, the Thracians left behind a symbolic language that still whispers across the centuries. In this chapter, we will step into their world of imagery, exploring how they used art to define who they were. The Thracian lands were rich in natural resources, particularly metals. Gold, silver, and bronze were mined from the mountains of the Balkans, and from very early times, Thracian craftsmen developed a remarkable skill in shaping these into objects of beauty and power. To the Thracians, gold was not simply wealth. It carried a sacred quality, reflecting sunlight, fire, and divine radiance. Many Thracian treasures discovered by archaeologists are made of pure gold, often fashioned into drinking vessels, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. These were not everyday items, but symbols of kingship, status, and spiritual connection. One of the most famous discoveries of Thracian art is the Panegyrished treasure, found in Bulgaria in 1949. This collection of golden vessels, including rhytons shaped like deer, goats, and human heads, is a striking example of Thracian craftsmanship. The details are breathtaking: finely worked muscles, expressive faces, and flowing designs. These vessels were likely used in religious rituals or feasts, where the act of drinking itself became a sacred performance. To lift a cup shaped like a stag was not just to drink, but to enter into communion with the animal spirit, to share in its strength and vitality. Animal symbolism was central to Thracian art. Stags, boars, lions, and birds frequently appear in their designs. Each carried specific meanings. The stag, with its antlers branching like a tree, symbolized regeneration and the cycles of life. The boar represented ferocity and courage in battle. Birds, especially eagles and falcons, connected the human world with the sky, acting as messengers between mortals and gods. By surrounding themselves with these images, the Thracians expressed their belief that humans and nature were bound together in a living spiritual network. Beyond animals, Thracian art often depicted mythological or divine figures. Some of these images appear uniquely Thracian, while others were influenced by contact with Greek and Persian neighbors. Goddesses, heroes, and enigmatic half-human beings fill their designs. One recurring figure is the Thracian horseman, often shown riding through forests, hunting animals, or holding symbolic objects. This image appears on countless reliefs, coins, and carvings, suggesting it was a unifying symbol across Thracian tribes. Scholars believe the horseman may represent a hero, a divine protector, or even a guardian of the dead. His presence in tombs suggests he guided souls into the afterlife, embodying courage, protection, and renewal. The Thracians also expressed themselves through tomb, art, and architecture. Large burial mounds, called tumuli, dominate parts of the Thracian landscape even today. Within these mounds lie chambers carefully constructed from stone, often decorated with frescoes or carvings. These tombs were not simply graves, but gateways to another realm. The art within them speaks of journeys, transformations, and the blending of life and death. Frescoes show chariots, feasts, and hunting scenes, suggesting the afterlife was not a place of rest alone, but a continuation of earthly pleasures and honors. One of the most impressive examples is the Kazanlak tomb, discovered in central Bulgaria. Its walls are adorned with vibrant paintings of a man and woman, perhaps a noble couple celebrating a feast. Around them, musicians and attendants complete the scene. Horses, painted in lively motion, remind us of the Thracian love for speed, power, and freedom. These images capture not only the wealth of the deceased but also their aspirations for eternity, to live forever in celebration. Surrounded by symbols of joy and honor, pottery, too, formed part of Thracian artistic expression. While not as elaborate as Greek ceramics, Thracian pottery carried its own symbolic weight. Geometric patterns, spirals, and natural motifs decorated everyday vessels. Some were likely used in rituals, holding offerings of food, drink, or incense. The act of shaping clay, like the shaping of gold, had spiritual meaning. Clay came from the earth, and transforming it into vessels symbolized human creativity joining with nature's abundance. Clothing and body art added another dimension. Ancient sources mention that Thracians wore brightly colored garments, often decorated with intricate patterns. These patterns, woven or embroidered, were not random, but reflected identity and status. Tattoos, too, played a role. The Thracians are one of the earliest European peoples recorded as practicing tattooing. For them, tattoos were marks of pride, not shame. They indicated bravery, achievements, or membership in certain groups. Each tattoo was a permanent piece of living art, inscribed on the warrior's skin, making the body itself a canvas of identity. The Thracians' artistic language extended into music and performance. Though little physical evidence remains, ancient writers describe Thracian songs, dances, and instruments. Music was inseparable from ritual and war. It expressed joy, grief, and spirituality. In this sense, Thracian art was never static. It moved, sang, and lived within the people themselves. A golden rhyton might gleam in silence, but when filled with wine and raised in song, it became part of a living ritual, uniting art, nature, and the divine. The influence of Thracian art did not remain confined to their homeland. Contact with Greeks, Persians, and later Romans meant that Thracian symbols traveled far. Greek artists sometimes borrowed Thracian motifs, while Thracian treasures found their way into foreign collections. The Thracian ability to blend their own traditions with outside influences shows their openness and creativity. They were not isolated barbarians but participants in a wider artistic dialogue of the ancient world. What makes Thracian art especially moving is its combination of strength and delicacy. The same people who wielded the heavy ramphia in battle also crafted golden vessels of astonishing refinement. This contrast reminds us that cultures are never one-dimensional. The Thracians were warriors, but also dreamers. They fought, but they also created. Their art reveals an inner world of imagination and belief, a world that gives us glimpses into how they understood life's mysteries. Today, Thracian treasures are displayed in museums, admired for their beauty. Yet to truly appreciate them, We must see them as more than objects. They were alive with meaning, carried in rituals, honored in tombs, worn on bodies, and celebrated in music. Each object was part of a story, connecting humans with gods, animals, and the cycles of nature. In the end, Thracian art and symbolism remind us of the human desire to make meaning visible. Through gold, stone, paint, and song, the Thracians told stories about courage, love, death, and renewal. Their art is a voice across time, still speaking, still resonating. Though their language is lost and their kingdoms vanished, the Thracians remain with us in the delicate curve of a golden rhyton, in the fierce eyes of a carved animal, in the quiet strength of a tomb painting. These are their voices, carved in stone and gold, carrying their memory into eternity. Chapter 17. Thracian Kings and Royal Power. Between myth and rulin, the study of the Thracians. One of the most fascinating aspects is their kingship. The Thracians were not a single unified nation, but a collection of tribes spread across a vast territory, each with its own customs, leaders, and traditions. Yet among these tribes, kings held a central place, standing at the crossroads between earthly authority and sacred duty. Thracian kings were more than political rulers. They were war leaders, judges, and mediators between their people and the divine. To understand them is to glimpse the structure of Thracian society, itself chaotic, diverse, but bound together by traditions of loyalty and respect. The idea of kingship among the Thracians was closely tied to myth. Ancient writers often remarked that Thracian rulers claimed descent from gods or heroes. A king was not simply chosen for his strength, though that mattered. He was expected to embody a spiritual link, to be someone whose authority carried a sense of inevitability, as though the gods themselves had appointed him. This explains why royal burials were so elaborate. A Thracian king did not simply die. He transformed, crossing into a realm where he continued his role in a higher form. His tomb became not just a grave, but a sacred monument, a place where the living could still honor his presence. Among the many Thracian rulers remembered in history, some names stand out because of their contact with powerful empires. Sutus III, for example, was a Thracian king who reigned in the 4th century BCE and established the city of Sutopolis. This city, though eventually submerged under modern reservoirs, revealed through archaeological excavations the sophistication of Thracian royal life. Its layout showed organized streets, monumental walls, and royal quarters. Sutus' tomb, discovered nearby, contained golden armor, jewelry, and even his horse's remains, reflecting the grandeur of his role. These discoveries remind us that Thracian kings were not peripheral chieftains, but figures of immense authority and wealth. The king's power, however, was not absolute. Unlike the centralized monarchies of Egypt or Persia, Thracian kingship had limits. A king depended on the loyalty of warrior nobles, men who led their own households and bands of fighters. These nobles could withdraw their support if they felt betrayed, and rivalries between tribes often meant that a king's influence was strong locally, but fragile beyond his immediate domain. In this way, Thracian politics was a delicate dance of alliances, feasts, marriages, and promises. A king who failed to reward his followers generously or protect them in war risked losing everything. Feasts played an especially important role in royal power. When a Thracian king held a banquet, it was not simply a social event. It was a performance of authority. Golden vessels gleamed on tables, musicians played, and warriors drank from ceremonial cups. In these moments, a king displayed his wealth and his ability to provide for his people. To drink from the king's table was both a gift and a pledge, a reminder that warriors fought under his banner, not only for glory but for the rewards he offered. Artifacts, such as the panegyrished treasure, with its intricate vessels, take on new meaning when we imagine them being raised in such royal feasts. The king's role also included religious responsibilities. Thracian rulers often acted as priests, conducting sacrifices and rituals to ensure the favor of gods. In some cases, kings themselves were seen as sacred. Greek historians wrote of Thracian tribes that worshipped their leaders, considering them divine after death. This blending of political and spiritual authority gave kings extraordinary importance, but also placed heavy burdens on them. A failed harvest, a defeat in battle, or a natural disaster could be seen as the king's failure in his sacred role. His power was glorious, but it was also precarious. Thracian kingship, however, was not uniform. Different tribes had different traditions. Some followed hereditary succession, passing kingship from father to son. Others allowed powerful nobles to choose a new leader, sometimes resulting in disputes and rivalries. This diversity reflected the broader Thracian world, a mosaic of tribes united by culture but divided by local customs. To the outside world, such as the Greeks and Romans, Thracian kings appeared both formidable and unpredictable, able to command vast armies but prone to sudden shifts of loyalty. One striking example of Thracian royal power is seen in the story of Codicai, a king of the Odrysian kingdom in the 4th century BCE. The Odrysians were one of the largest Thracian confederations, and Codicai expanded their influence significantly. He established relations with Athens, traded wine and gold, and built alliances across the Aegean world. Yet his reign was marked by constant challenges from rival tribes and ambitious nobles. This tension between power and instability defined much of Thracian kingship. A king could rise high, but he always stood on shifting ground. Royal tombs provide us with vivid evidence of Thracian kings' prestige. The Sfeshtari tomb, for example, discovered in 1982, contains intricate carvings of female figures with raised arms believed to be protectors of the dead king. The ceiling is painted with stars, symbolizing eternity. The entire structure speaks of cosmic symbolism, as though the king did not merely join his ancestors but became part of the universe itself. This reflects how Thracian kings were imagined as central to both earthly and divine order. Even in warfare, kingship carried symbolic weight. A Thracian king led his warriors into battle, not only as a commander, but as a figure of inspiration. His armor, often adorned with gold, reflected sunlight, making him visible on the field. His horse, richly decorated, carried him forward like a living emblem of power. The king's presence encouraged loyalty, and his bravery became a measure for all. To fight alongside the king was to fight for honor itself. As we reflect on Thracian kings, it is important to remember that they were not isolated figures. They existed within networks of warriors, priests, craftsmen, and common folk. Their authority rested on the collective belief that kingship mattered, that it bound society together in times of peace and in times of crisis. Without this belief, even the most powerful king would be only another warrior. The story of Thracian kingship is therefore one of balance, between myth and reality, between power and fragility, between the individual and the community. Through their tombs, treasures, and the echoes of their names in ancient texts, Thracian kings remind us of the universal human struggle to create order, meaning, and continuity in a world of uncertainty. Their crowns were not of permanent stone, but of delicate gold, gleaming, fragile, yet unforgettable. And though their kingdoms faded, their legacy still shines in the treasures uncovered from the earth, in the myths remembered by neighbors, and in the sense that these rulers once stood at the center of a world now lost to time. Chapter 18: Thracian Trade and Cultural Exchange, a hidden web of connections. The Thracians are often remembered as fierce warriors and mysterious tribes, dwelling in the mountains and plains of southeastern Europe. Yet beneath this warrior image lay another dimension of their world: trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. While they did not build vast empires like the Egyptians or the Persians, the Thracians were far from isolated. They occupied a land that was rich in resources and strategically located, a crossroads between Europe and Asia. This geography turned Thrace into a place where people, goods, and ideas constantly flowed. Trade, for the Thracians, was not simply about survival. It was also about identity and power. Their rivers carried boats laden with goods. Their forests provided timber, honey, and furs. Their mines yielded gold and silver that gleamed in sunlight and filled the treasuries of kings. Through trade, the Thracians connected themselves to wider worlds, sometimes adopting foreign styles, sometimes preserving their own, and always leaving their mark on history. One of the most striking examples of Thracian trade is the circulation of gold treasures. Thrace was famously rich in gold. Ancient writers marveled at the abundance of precious metals in the region, and archaeological discoveries confirm their words. Golden masks, jewelry, vessels, and weapons, unearthed from Thracian tombs, reveal not only the skill of local craftsmen, but also the taste for luxury that connected the Thracian elite to broader Mediterranean culture. Many of these objects show artistic influences from Greece, Persia, and even Scythia, proving that Thracian artisans were both skilled creators and eager learners of foreign styles. But trade was not limited to luxury goods. Everyday items also reveal the rhythms of exchange. Pottery, for instance, is a silent witness to cultural contact. Thracian households used locally made ceramics, but excavations show that imported Greek pottery was also common, especially in wealthier settlements. These finely painted vessels, often depicting mythological scenes, carried not only wine and oil, but also the stories and symbols of Greek culture into Thracian homes. A simple amphora could be both a container of trade goods and a carrier of ideas. Wine was another central element of Thracian exchange. The Thracians themselves were famous for their love of wine, often drinking it unmixed, unlike the Greeks who diluted it with water. They produced wine in abundance, and Greek sources frequently mention Thracian wine as strong and desirable. In return, Thracian tribes imported goods such as olive oil, fine textiles, and weapons. This mutual exchange created bonds but also highlighted differences. To drink Thracian wine from a Greek cup was to participate in a cultural blending that shaped identities on both sides. The coastal Thracian tribes benefited greatly from maritime trade. Along the Aegean coast, Greek colonies such as Abdera, Apollonia, and Mesembria served as hubs of exchange. Thracians brought resources from inland timber, metals, grain, and received in return not only goods but also contact with new ideas. These port cities became meeting places where Thracian warriors, Greek merchants, and travelers from distant lands all interacted. Over time, such contact influenced Thracian art, architecture, and even social organization. Yet trade was not always peaceful. Control of trade routes often led to conflict. Thracian tribes fought over access to rivers, mountain passes, and coastal settlements. Powerful kings, such as those of the Odrysian kingdom, sought to regulate trade, imposing taxes on merchants, and using wealth to strengthen their armies. This tension reveals the dual nature of trade. It connected people, but also became a source of rivalry. A caravan of goods could just as easily spark violence as it could foster cooperation beyond material goods. Ideas and beliefs also traveled through trade. Religious practices, symbols, and artistic motifs crossed borders with merchants and artisans. For example, certain Thracian burial practices bear similarities to Scythian customs, suggesting exchanges between these neighboring cultures. Likewise, Greek myths often incorporated Thracian elements, such as the figure of Orpheus, the legendary musician said to be of Thracian origin. In this way, trade was not simply economic. It was also spiritual and intellectual. A particularly fascinating aspect of Thracian trade was their relationship with the Greek world. While the Greeks often viewed Thracians as barbarians, they also admired their resources and skills. Greek playwrights and historians wrote about Thracian gold, Thracian mercenaries, and Thracian musicians. Athens, in particular, relied heavily on Thrace for timber to build its naval fleet. Without Thracian wood, the ships that fought at Salamis or patrolled the Aegean might never have existed. In return, Greek culture penetrated Thrace through colonies, trade goods, and shared rituals. The Romans, too, became deeply connected to Thracian trade. When Rome expanded into the Balkans, it quickly recognized the wealth of Thrace. Roman roads, carved through the land, linking Thracian settlements to markets across the empire. Thracian wine, horses, and slaves became valuable exports, while Roman coins and luxuries flowed back into Thracian lands. This Roman integration gradually transformed Thracian society, weaving it into the fabric of imperial commerce. Craftsmanship deserves special attention here. Thracian artisans were not passive recipients of foreign influence. They adapted styles to their own traditions, creating unique blends. A golden vessel might carry Greek motifs, but its shape or use could reflect Thracian ritual. Jewelry often combined geometric Thracian patterns with foreign techniques. This creativity turned trade into more than a transaction. It was an ongoing dialogue between cultures, with the Thracians confidently asserting their identity while embracing external inspirations. For ordinary Thracians, trade also shaped daily life. Farmers might bring surplus grain to a local market, exchanging it for pottery or tools. Shepherds could trade wool and hides for salt or metal. Women might sell woven textiles or crafted ornaments. Though less glamorous than golden treasures, these exchanges sustained communities and connected villages to broader networks. The marketplace was not only economic, but also social, a place where stories were told, songs were sung, and news from distant lands was shared. The spiritual dimension of trade should not be overlooked. Many goods carried symbolic meaning. A cup imported from Greece could be used in a Thracian ritual, transforming it from mere pottery into a sacred vessel. A weapon forged with foreign techniques might be offered in a burial, symbolizing both martial skill and cosmopolitan reach. These layers of meaning remind us that trade was never just about wealth. It was also about weaving cultural threads into the fabric of life and death. Looking at Thracian trade through archaeological finds reveals how interconnected their world truly was. Amphorae from the Aegean, coins from distant cities, ornaments reflecting Persian or Scythian styles all speak of a people who, while fiercely proud of their independence, were also participants in a larger web. They did not live on the margins of history. They were central players in the constant movement of goods and ideas across the ancient world. In the end, the story of Thracian trade is a story of balance between giving and receiving, between preserving traditions and adopting new ones. It shows us that the Thracians, though often depicted as wild and warlike, were also thoughtful participants in cultural exchange. Their treasures, their cities, and their artifacts bear witness to a people who understood the power of connection. When we look at their golden vessels, their imported pottery, and the ruins of their marketplaces, we are reminded that even in the ancient past, no society existed in isolation. The Thracians lived at the heart of crossroads, where every exchange was both material and symbolic, both a necessity and a story. And in that endless flow of goods and ideas, the Thracians left behind a legacy of richness, creativity, and openness that still speaks across the centuries. Chapter 19. Thracian beliefs about death and the afterlife beyond the veil. The Thracians were not only warriors, traders, and farmers. They were also thinkers, poets, and mystics who pondered one of the greatest questions of existence: what happens after death? To understand Thracian culture, one must understand how deeply their beliefs about death shaped their lives, their rituals, and their art. For the Thracians, death was not an end but a passage, a continuation of the journey of the soul into another realm. Their funerary practices, myths, and sacred traditions open a window into a worldview that was as mysterious as it was profound. Ancient Greek historians, who often wrote about the Thracians, were fascinated by their unique attitudes toward death. Herodotus, for instance, noted that some Thracian tribes celebrated death as a release from the hardships of life, while the Greeks mourned with lamentations. Certain Thracian groups were said to greet death with songs and feasts, believing that the soul had escaped suffering and entered a better world. This perspective sets the Thracians apart from many of their neighbors, who often regarded death with dread and despair. Archaeological discoveries have given us a clearer picture of how these beliefs were expressed. The Thracians left behind elaborate tombs, many of which still stand today as silent monuments to their vision of the afterlife. These tombs, often built with stone chambers and decorated with vivid wall paintings, were not merely resting places, they were gateways. Within them, the Thracians placed offerings, jewelry, weapons, pottery, food, and sometimes even sacrificed animals so that the dead would be equipped for their journey into the next world. One of the most famous Thracian tombs is the Kazanlak tomb, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Inside, its walls are adorned with frescoes depicting feasting, music, and ritual. The images are not of sorrow, but of celebration. They show the deceased entering a realm of eternal festivity, accompanied by horses, banquets, and companions. Such imagery suggests that the Thracians saw the afterlife as a continuation of life's joys, magnified into eternity. To step beyond death was to step into abundance, honor, and freedom. Horses played a particularly symbolic role in Thracian burial customs. Many tombs contain horse burials alongside their human masters. For the Thracians, horses were sacred animals, symbols of strength, status, and guidance. By burying them with the dead, the Thracians ensured that the soul would ride into the afterlife with dignity and swiftness. The bond between human and animal was not broken by death. It was carried into the next existence. The practice of burying treasures with the deceased reveals another dimension of Thracian belief. Gold masks, ornate jewelry, and ceremonial vessels were often placed in tombs. These were not simply displays of wealth. They were symbols of the soul's power and divine favor. The golden mask, for example, may have represented the transformation of the human face into a divine or eternal form. To cover the dead with gold was to honor their passage into immortality. But what did the Thracians truly believe awaited them in the afterlife? While their myths were never written down by their own hand, Greek sources and archaeological evidence suggest a belief in a realm of eternal existence, perhaps even reincarnation. Some accounts describe Thracians believing that the soul was immortal, and that death was only the shedding of the body. This belief is strikingly similar to certain Orphic and Pythagorean traditions in Greece, and indeed, the legendary figure Orpheus the mystic poet, who descended into the underworld, was said to be of Thracian origin. The Orphic connection is particularly fascinating. Orpheus, with his music, could charm animals, stones, and even gods. He entered the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, making him a bridge between life and death. The fact that the Greeks placed Orpheus in Thrace is no accident. It reflects the reputation of the Thracians as people deeply concerned with the mysteries of death and the soul. Orphic teachings, which emphasized purification, the immortality of the soul, and union with the divine, may well have been inspired by Thracian traditions. Funeral rituals among the Thracians were elaborate and varied. Some tribes practiced cremation, while others favored inhumation in barrows or chamber tombs. These barrows or burial mounds still dot the landscapes of Bulgaria, Romania, and northern Greece. Standing silently on the plains and hillsides, they are enduring testaments to a people who honored their dead with care and reverence. Within these mounds, archaeologists often find not only the remains of the deceased, but also offerings of food, drink, and personal belongings. Each object tells a story, each placement a ritual act designed to ensure safe passage beyond the veil. The Thracians also believed in the possibility of communication between the living and the dead. Rituals, songs and offerings were performed not only at the time of burial, but also long afterward. Family members might return to tombs to leave gifts, pour libations, or seek guidance from their ancestors. Death, in this view, was not a wall, but a doorway through which relationships could continue. The spirits of the dead were protectors, advisors, and sometimes feared presences that demanded respect. This perspective shaped the Thracian approach to warfare as well. Warriors who fell in battle were honored as heroes, their memory preserved through burial rites that elevated them to almost divine status. To die bravely was not to be lost but to be remembered, celebrated, and perhaps even worshipped. In this way, the Thracian belief in the afterlife reinforced their culture of courage, giving warriors the assurance that death was not an end, but a transformation. We must also consider the darker aspects of Thracian funerary practices. Some accounts suggest that human sacrifice may have accompanied certain burials, especially those of kings or nobles. Servants, concubines, or warriors might be sacrificed to accompany their master into the next life. While this practice may shock modern sensibilities, it reflected the Thracian conviction that life continued after death, and that loyalty, even unto death, ensured harmony in the world beyond. The Thracian vision of death was not purely individual. It also had communal and cosmic dimensions. Funerary feasts, music, and processions were social events that reinforced bonds among the living while honoring the dead. At the same time, they reflected a cosmic order, where the cycles of life and death mirrored the cycles of nature. Just as the sun set and rose, so too did the soul depart and continue. Death was part of a larger harmony, one that the Thracians sought to align themselves with through ritual and belief. The Thracians' approach to death also influenced their art. Many of their artistic motifs are spirals, horses, solar symbols are connected to the themes of eternity, journey, and rebirth. These images, carved into stone or painted onto tomb walls, carried meanings that transcended this world. They were visual prayers, guiding the soul and reminding the living of the mysteries beyond. When we step back and consider Thracian beliefs about death, we find a culture that embraced mortality with unusual acceptance. Rather than fearing death, they incorporated it into their worldview as a necessary and even joyous passage. Their tombs, treasures, and rituals all speak of a people who saw death not as loss but as transformation. In this way, the Thracians leave us with a lesson that resonates even today. They remind us that death need not be a terror. It can also be a mystery, a continuation, a doorway into realms unknown. To the Thracians, to live bravely and to die honorably was to join the eternal flow of existence, carried onward by ancestors, gods, and the music of Orpheus himself. Their tombs still stand, their treasures still gleam, and their beliefs still whisper through the ages. In their vision of death, we glimpse not only their past, but also a universal human hope that beyond the veil lies not nothingness, but meaning, continuity, and perhaps even joy. Chapter 20. The Legacy of the Thracians echoes through time. The Thracians, though long absorbed into the great tides of history, did not vanish without leaving a lasting mark. Their story, stretching across centuries of warfare, ritual, art, and belief, is not confined to the ruins of tombs or the fragments of pottery buried beneath the soil. It lingers in myths, in traditions, in languages, and in the memory of those who have tried to trace the whispers of their presence. To speak of the legacy of the Thracians is to recognize how an ancient people, often overshadowed by their more famous neighbors, shaped the cultural, spiritual, and historical fabric of Europe. At their height, the Thracians were among the largest ethnic groups in ancient Europe, occupying lands from the northern Aegean to the Carpathian Mountains, from the Black Sea to the Danube. Yet, unlike the Greeks or the Romans, they left no great cities of stone, no written histories of their own. Instead, their legacy comes to us through the lens of others, through Greek historians, Roman conquerors, and the silent testimony of archaeology. Despite this, their influence remains unmistakable. One of the clearest marks of Thracian legacy lies in mythology. The Greeks borrowed heavily from Thracian traditions, weaving them into their own sacred stories. Orpheus, the legendary poet and musician who could charm the underworld itself, was said to be his teachings, which became the foundation of the Orphic mysteries, carried Thracian concepts of death, rebirth, and the immortality of the soul far beyond their homeland. Through Orpheus, the Thracians left an imprint on Greek religion, and, from there, on the wider Mediterranean world, the Thracian horseman and image found carved and painted across their lands became one of the most enduring symbols of their culture. Depicted as a mounted figure, often hunting or performing a sacred act, this motif outlived the Thracians themselves, continuing into Roman times and beyond. The horseman symbol carried meanings of protection, vitality, and divine presence. Even centuries later, echoes of the Thracian horseman can be found in Balkan folklore, a lingering shadow of an ancient belief that never entirely faded. Thracian music and poetry also left their mark. Ancient writers often described Thracians as a musical people, their songs both haunting and powerful. The very association of Orpheus with Thrace suggests that music was central to their identity. Though the melodies have been lost, their reputation endured. The idea of music as a bridge between the human and the divine, so central to Greek thought, may well have been inherited from Thracian traditions. In the realm of warfare, the Thracians were both feared and respected. Their warriors, renowned for their ferocity, became sought-after mercenaries in Greek and Roman armies. The distinctive curved sword, the sika, became a symbol of Thracian martial skill. Even when their own kingdoms were conquered, Thracian warriors carried their identity into foreign lands, leaving behind stories of valor and strength. The Spartacus revolt, led by a Thracian gladiator, stands as one of the most dramatic testaments to their enduring spirit of resistance. The Thracians also influenced art and craftsmanship. Their skill with gold was extraordinary. Treasures uncovered from their tombs, ornate cups, jewelry, and ceremonial masks display artistry that rivals that of any great civilization of the ancient world. These treasures, now displayed in museums, remind us of a people who celebrated beauty, power, and the sacred through their creations. The Thracian love of spirals, solar motifs, and intricate animal designs reflects a worldview steeped in symbolism, one that continues to inspire modern artists and historians alike. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of the Thracian legacy lies in their spiritual worldview. Their beliefs about death, the soul, and the afterlife reveal a culture that saw beyond the immediate and into the eternal. The idea that death was not an end, but a passage resonates even today, offering insight into the universality of human hope. By celebrating death as liberation, the Thracians remind us of an alternative way to face mortality, not with fear, but with reverence for the mystery of what lies beyond. As Rome expanded, the Thracians gradually lost their independence. Their lands were absorbed into the empire, their tribes scattered, their kings dethroned, yet assimilation did not erase them. Instead, Thracian blood flowed into the Roman legions. Their traditions blended into Roman practices, and their myths found new life in Roman religion. Even as a distinct people, the Thracians disappeared. Their essence was carried forward through the cultures that succeeded them. The enduring presence of Thracian heritage can also be traced in the modern Balkans. Place names, folk traditions, and even genetic studies point to a continuity that stretches back thousands of years. Though centuries of migration and conquest have reshaped the region, the Thracian contribution remains part of its foundation. In a sense, the Thracians never truly vanished. They became part of the living fabric of southeastern Europe. Today, archaeological sites, such as the tombs of Kazanlak and Astari, the treasures of Panagyurist and Rogozin, and the countless burial mounds across Bulgaria and Romania, stand as guardians of Thracian memory. Each artifact uncovered adds another piece to the puzzle, reminding us that the Thracians were not shadows, but vibrant, complex people with their own vision of life and death. The Thracian legacy also lives in the fascination they inspire. Historians, archaeologists, and storytellers continue to study them, drawn by the mystery of a people, both present and absent, visible in fragments, but elusive as a whole. This mystery itself may be their greatest legacy, the enduring sense of wonder they leave behind, urging us to look deeper, to imagine, and to remember. In reflecting on the Thracians, we are reminded of the fragility and resilience of human culture. They rose, flourished, and fell, yet they left traces strong enough to survive millennia. Their songs may be silent, but their story still sings. Their kingdoms may be gone, but their spirit endures in legend, art, and the very soil of the lands they once called home. As we close this journey through the world of the Thracians, we stand at the threshold of history and memory. Their legacy is not just in what they left behind, but in how we choose to remember them. To study the Thracians is to honor their lives, their beliefs, and their contributions. It is to keep alive the echo of voices that might otherwise be lost. In the end, the Thracians teach us that even a people without great monuments or written histories can shape the destiny of civilizations. Their presence endures in the myths of Orpheus, in the treasures of their tombs, in the courage of their warriors, and in the traditions of their descendants. They remind us that legacy is not always carved in stone, it is woven into the very fabric of human memory. The Thracians have long since walked into the mists of history. Yet, if we listen closely, we can still hear the faint echo of their drums, the whisper of their songs, and the thunder of their horses across the plains. They remind us that no people is ever truly forgotten, so long as their story is told. And tonight, as we end this tale, we carry with us not only the memory of the Thracians, but also the timeless truth they embodied, that life, death, and legacy are all part of the great journey of humanity. The Thracians may have vanished as a nation, but their spirit lives in myths, in treasures, and in the very soil of Europe. Their story reminds us that no people is ever truly lost, so long as their memory is kept alive. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the echoes of history are waiting, and we will uncover them together.